When a doctor stops healing and starts hunting, the operating table transforms into an altar of unspeakable agony, where every deliberate scalpel stroke carves a gospel of torment into trembling flesh, where blood doesn't merely stain the ancient stone but burrows deep into its pores, becoming one with the foundation itself, whispering the forgotten names of souls who walked through iron gates alive but never walked anywhere again, their final moments absorbed into walls that remember everything and forget nothing. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker. Tonight, we dive into 4 true crimes, each more gripping than the last. If you enjoy them, a like, comment, or subscribe helps keep the truth alive. Now, this is the story of the Mad Master of Edinburgh Castle. They called him a doctor, a gentleman, a man of wealth and refinement. But behind the iron gates of his fortress, Lewis Hutchinson wasn't healing bodies, he was collecting them. This is the story of a predator who turned his castle into an abattoir, where screams echoed through stone corridors and disappeared into Scottish mist. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of the Mad Master, a monster who didn't lurk in shadows. He lived in plain sight, smiled at his neighbors, and made murder his masterpiece. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. The year was 1735, and Edinburgh Castle stood like a medieval thong jutting from Scottish soil, its turrets scraping clouds heavy with rain. But this isn't the Edinburgh Castle you're thinking of, the famous fortress that dominates the city's skyline. No, this was a different castle entirely, a private estate that Lewis Hutchinson had claimed as his kingdom of horrors. Lewis Hutchinson arrived in Jamaica as a young physician from Scotland, his medical credentials polished, his manners impeccable. He carried himself with the bearing of nobility, speaking in cultured tones that made plantation owners and colonial administrators nod with approval. Money flowed to him easily, through his medical practice, through strategic social connections, through means that history has conveniently forgotten to record with precision. With his wealth, Hutchinson purchased a sprawling estate in the remote hills overlooking Spanish Town, Jamaica's capital. The property came with a peculiar structure already built upon it, a fortress-like building with thick stone walls, narrow windows positioned too high for anyone inside to see out properly, and a layout that seemed designed less for comfort and more for containment. The locals called it Edinburgh Castle, though whether Hutchinson named it himself or merely inherited the designation remains unclear. What is clear is that he transformed it into something far worse than its ominous exterior suggested. Hutchinson cultivated the image of a Renaissance man with meticulous care. He hosted elaborate dinners where candlelight gleamed off silver and crystal, while servants glided through rooms bearing trays of roasted meats and imported wines. His guests, merchants, officials, fellow physicians, never suspected that their charming host harbored appetites that extended far beyond cuisine and conversation. They didn't notice how his eyes would track certain servants with an intensity that went beyond mere supervision. They didn't question why his household staff seemed to rotate with unusual frequency, faces disappearing and being replaced without explanation. The castle itself became an extension of Hutchinson's dual nature. Its public rooms sparkled with refinement, polished wood, ornate furniture, walls lined with books that suggested intellectual depth. But its private spaces told a different story entirely. The basement stretched deeper than any normal foundation required, its chambers interconnected by passages that seemed to serve no architectural purpose. The walls were unusually thick, the kind of thickness that swallows sound and traps it inside stone until it dies. Hutchinson's medical background gave him knowledge that most killers never possess, an understanding of anatomy that went beyond mere violence into something approaching artistry, albeit of the most depraved kind. He knew exactly where to cut to prolong suffering, which nerves to sever to maximize pain while preventing death from arriving too quickly. His instruments weren't cobbled together from common tools. They were surgical implements designed for precision, repurposed for atrocity. The first victims were the invisible ones, slaves, servants, people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger investigations because their lives barely registered in the colonial record-keeping of the time. Hutchinson selected them with a predator's patience, choosing those who were isolated, those who had recently arrived on the island and hadn't yet formed protective social connections. He would offer them positions in his household, promising better conditions than they'd find elsewhere. And they would accept because what choice did they have? They would walk through Edinburgh Castle's gates, and for many of them, walking was the last thing they'd ever do freely. The pattern emerged slowly, visible only to those who cared to look, and in colonial Jamaica, few people cared to look very hard at the fate of enslaved people. But whispers started circulating through the quarters where slaves lived. Warnings passed in hushed tones about the doctor's castle, about people who went there and were never seen again. These weren't just disappearances explained away by escape attempts or sales to other plantations. These were absolute vanishings, as if the earth had opened and swallowed people whole. Hutchinson was careful at first, spacing out his kills, maintaining the facade of normalcy between his descents into depravity. But something happened to him during this period, something that transformed occasional violence into systematic slaughter. Perhaps it was the absolute power he held over his victims, the godlike control he exercised within his castle walls. Perhaps it was the realization that he could do virtually anything without consequence, that the colonial system's indifference to certain lives created a perfect hunting ground for a man with his particular hungers. His methodology evolved into something approaching routine. He would lure or coerce victims into the lower levels of Edinburgh Castle, into rooms where the screaming couldn't penetrate stone thick enough to build fortifications. There, he would indulge every sadistic impulse his medical knowledge could devise. He kept some victims alive for days, treating their wounds just enough to prevent death, only to inflict fresh torments once they'd regained enough consciousness to fully experience them. The castle's isolation worked in his favor. Built on elevated ground surrounded by his own extensive property, visitors approached only by invitation, and those invitations were carefully controlled. Neighbors lived far enough away that sounds didn't carry, and even if they had, the prevailing attitude towards slaves suffering meant that screams from a plantation, if noticed at all, would be dismissed as the normal background noise of colonial brutality. Hutchinson's confidence grew with each successful murder. He began taking risks that a more cautious killer would never attempt, leaving bodies in locations where they might be discovered rather than ensuring their complete disappearance. This wasn't carelessness born of stupidity, it was the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, who had tested the limits of what he could do and found those limits to be virtually non-existent. By 1760, Lewis Hutchinson had perfected his craft. Edinburgh Castle had become a machine designed for murder, its architecture modified to serve slaughter. The basement chambers now featured drainage systems that channeled blood away from torture areas, preventing the kind of pooling that would make the floors slippery and interfere with his work. Hooks protruded from ceiling beams at intervals. Hutchinson had calculated precisely for suspending bodies at heights that gave him optimal access to their anatomy. His victim count climbed into numbers that historians would later struggle to verify with certainty. Estimates ranging from dozens to over 100 souls destroyed within those stone walls. The exact number became impossible to determine because Hutchinson didn't just kill people. He made them disappear so completely that even records of their existence faded into uncertainty. The Mad Master's techniques evolved beyond mere torture into something that resembled perverse experimentation. His medical training had taught him how bodies functioned. Now he wanted to discover how they malfunctioned, how far he could push human physiology before it collapsed. He would induce wounds and then observe how long it took for shock to set in, taking notes with the same clinical detachment he might have used when studying disease progression in patients he was actually trying to help. Some victims he kept imprisoned for weeks, creating a horrific calendar of suffering where each day brought new violations. He would alternate between physical torture and psychological torment, sometimes leaving them alone in darkness for days before returning with sudden violence that their fear-saturated minds couldn't anticipate or prepare for. The isolation itself became a weapon. He understood that the human mind, deprived of stimulation except for periodic agony, begins to fracture in ways that purely physical torture cannot achieve. Hutchinson developed preferences, patterns that reveal themselves when examining the fragmentary records that survived. He favored certain types of victims, young adults in the prime of their physical condition, people whose bodies could endure extended suffering before succumbing. He wasn't interested in quick deaths. He wanted time to explore every possibility for inflicting pain, to test every technique his imagination conceived. The disposal of bodies became increasingly brazen. Initially, Hutchinson had been cautious about concealing remains, burying them in remote areas of his extensive property or destroying them through methods too disturbing to detail fully. But as his kills accumulated and consequences failed to materialize, he grew careless, or perhaps deliberately provocative. Bodies began appearing in locations where discovery was inevitable. Dumped along roads, left in areas frequented by other colonists, positioned in ways that suggested the killer wanted his work acknowledged even if his identity remained hidden. This shift from concealment to display reveals something crucial about Hutchinson's psychology. The act of killing alone no longer satisfied him. He needed recognition, needed the community to know that a predator walked among them, even if they couldn't identify him. Each body left in the open was a taunt, a declaration that someone powerful enough to kill with impunity was operating in their midst. The colonial authorities found themselves in an impossible position. The bodies were undeniable, but the social structure that kept Jamaica functioning depended on maintaining certain fictions, including the fiction that the colonial elite were civilized people bringing order to a savage place. Acknowledging that one of their own was a serial killer would shatter that fiction, would force them to confront the reality that the real savagery often wore expensive clothes and spoke with refined accents. Whispers about Edinburgh Castle grew louder despite officials' reluctance to investigate seriously. The enslaved population knew, they had always known, that Hutchinson was hunting them. Information networks that existed below the awareness of colonial record keepers spread warnings about the Mad Doctor, about his castle where people went to die screaming. Enslaved people began refusing assignments to Hutchinson's estate, risking punishment from their own masters rather than face what awaited them at Edinburgh Castle. But Hutchinson's appetite wouldn't be satisfied by victims who came willingly or could be easily controlled. As his preferred prey became more cautious, he adapted his hunting methods. He began abducting people directly, using his social position to move freely through areas where a lesser man would be questioned. He would encounter isolated travelers on remote roads, offer them transportation or assistance, and then deliver them to his castle's horrors. His technique combined careful planning with opportunistic violence. Hutchinson studied patterns. He knew which roads saw light traffic at certain times, which areas of the countryside offered concealment for ambushes, which potential victims lacked the social connections that might trigger serious investigations into their disappearances. He used his medical knowledge to incapacitate victims quickly through pressure points or drugs, ensuring they couldn't fight back effectively or cry out for help that might bring witnesses. The castle's physical modifications continued evolving to accommodate his expanding operation. New chambers appeared in the basement complex, each designed for specific purposes within his taxonomy of torture. One room featured walls lined with implements arranged with surgical precision. Knives of varying sizes, saws, devices whose purposes remain mercifully unclear from surviving descriptions. Another chamber contained restraint systems so elaborate they suggested months of planning and custom construction. Hutchinson documented some of his activities in notebooks that investigators would later discover, journals filled with clinical observations about his victims' responses to various forms of torture. He recorded details with the detachment of a scientist conducting experiments. How long certain wounds took to cause unconsciousness, which combinations of injuries produced the most satisfying screams, observations about how different individuals' pain thresholds varied based on age, gender, and physical condition. These journals reveal a man who had completely divorced himself from normal human empathy, who viewed other people not as fellow beings but as biological mechanisms to be taken apart and studied. His writing displays no hint of guilt or moral conflict. Only curiosity, satisfaction, and occasionally frustration when victims died before he'd finished with them. The Mad Master's reign had reached its apex. He operated with virtual impunity, protected by social privilege and the colonial system's institutional indifference to certain lives. But empires built on atrocity eventually collapse, and Hutchinson's would be no exception. The foundation of his carefully constructed nightmare was beginning to crack. The beginning of Louis Hutchinson's downfall didn't arrive through official investigation or legal intervention. It came through the courage of those he'd spent years terrorizing. The enslaved community, living under constant threat from the Mad Master's appetites, began organizing resistance through channels invisible to colonial authorities. Information networks that had been warning people away from Edinburgh Castle evolved into something more proactive. Rather than simply avoiding Hutchinson, people started tracking his movements, noting patterns in his hunting behavior, identifying times and locations where he was most likely to be vulnerable. This coordination required extraordinary bravery given the consequences if discovered, but fear had transformed into determination among people who understood they were fighting for survival. One of Hutchinson's attempted abductions failed when his intended victim fought back harder than expected and managed to escape into nearby woods. This wasn't the first time someone had resisted, but it was the first time someone resisted successfully and lived to spread detailed warnings about his methods. The survivor's account circulated through enslaved communities with the speed of wildfire, providing tactical information about how the Mad Doctor operated, where he struck, what tricks he used to lure or force people into his carriage. This intelligence proved invaluable. Several subsequent abduction attempts failed when potential victims recognized Hutchinson's approach and avoided isolation or called for help before he could incapacitate them. Each failure chipped away at his sense of invincibility, introducing an element he'd rarely experienced: fear of consequences. But Hutchinson's downfall accelerated dramatically when he made his most catastrophic mistake. He killed someone whose disappearance couldn't be ignored or explained away through the usual colonial mechanisms. The victim's identity remains disputed in historical accounts, with some sources claiming it was a free person of color who held minor but notable social standing, while others suggest it was someone connected to a colonial official through family ties that made their death politically inconvenient. What matters is that this killing crossed lines even the corrupt colonial justice system couldn't completely ignore. Questions were raised in contexts where they couldn't be dismissed. Officials who had spent years deliberately not investigating Edinburgh Castle's horrors suddenly found themselves under pressure to take action or explain their inaction. The political calculation changed. Protecting Hutchinson now created more problems than prosecuting him. The investigation that followed was cursory by any legitimate standard but unprecedented in the context of Hutchinson's previous immunity. Colonial officials approached Edinburgh Castle with warrants that Hutchinson initially refused to acknowledge, barricading himself inside his fortress and declaring that no authority existed that could compel him to submit to interrogation. This defiance proved catastrophic. Had Hutchinson surrendered peacefully and relied on his social connections to navigate the legal system, he might have escaped serious consequences. Instead, his refusal to cooperate transformed a manageable scandal into a colonial crisis that required dramatic resolution. Officials who might have been satisfied with cursory investigation now needed to be seen taking decisive action. When authorities finally forced entry into Edinburgh Castle after a tense standoff, what they discovered exceeded even the darkest rumors that had circulated for years. The basement chambers revealed the full scope of Hutchinson's depravity. Rooms specifically designed for torture, drainage systems constructed to handle quantities of blood that told their own horrific story, instruments of suffering arranged with the precision of a surgeon's operating theater. But the most damning evidence came from Hutchinson's journals, discovered in his study where he'd apparently been reviewing them when authorities arrived. These documents laid out his activities in meticulous detail, including victim counts, descriptions of torture techniques, and observations recorded with the clinical detachment of scientific research. The journals transformed what might have been a case built on circumstantial evidence into an undeniable catalog of atrocities. The remains found within Edinburgh Castle's grounds and surrounding property confirmed what the journals described. Bodies in various stages of decomposition, skeletal remains buried in shallow graves, evidence of disposal methods too disturbing for period newspapers to describe explicitly. All of it pointed towards systematic murder conducted over many years. Hutchinson's response to discovery was telling. He showed no remorse, no panic, no attempt to deny or minimize his actions. Instead, he seemed almost proud of his work, speaking about his victims in terms that suggested he viewed them as accomplishments rather than crimes. This complete absence of moral recognition shocked even hardened colonial officials who had witnessed plenty of brutality in their careers. The speed of his trial reflected the political necessity of resolving the scandal quickly rather than any genuine commitment to justice. Proceedings lasted only days, with testimony from survivors, presentation of physical evidence from the castle, and readings from Hutchinson's own journals providing overwhelming proof of guilt. His defense attempted to argue temporary insanity, a strategy that might have worked if Hutchinson himself hadn't contradicted it by speaking lucidly about his crimes with obvious awareness of their nature. The verdict arrived with predetermined certainty. Guilty of murder, multiplied across victim counts that the court couldn't precisely enumerate but acknowledged as extensive. The sentence was equally inevitable in a colonial system that demanded public spectacle to restore order. Death by hanging, to be carried out swiftly before political pressure or social connections could intervene. But even after conviction, Hutchinson retained the arrogance that had characterized his killing spree. He showed no fear of approaching execution, no spiritual crisis or last-minute attempts at redemption. Instead, he used his remaining time to taunt authorities with suggestions that the full extent of his murders might never be known, that Edinburgh Castle held secrets that hadn't been discovered, that his true victim count exceeded what the investigation had uncovered. These claims were calculated to ensure his infamy would persist beyond death, that his name would continue generating fear and fascination long after his body stopped swinging from the gallows. And in this final goal, the Mad Master of Edinburgh Castle would prove terrifyingly successful. March 16, 1773, the execution date arrived carrying weight that transcended typical colonial justice. This wasn't merely the punishment of a criminal. It was a ritual exorcism, an attempt by Jamaican colonial society to purge itself of the monster it had allowed to operate for decades. Thousands gathered to witness Lewis Hutchinson's hanging, a crowd larger than typically assembled for executions even in an era when public death served as popular entertainment. They came from across the island, traveling for days to reach Spanish Town, driven by morbid curiosity and the need to confirm that the Mad Master would actually face consequences for his atrocities. Hutchinson's final walk to the gallows revealed no trace of the fear that consumed his victims during their last moments. He moved with deliberate calm, his expression conveying not acceptance of punishment but disdain for the proceedings. When offered the opportunity to make a final statement, a tradition that usually elicited religious conversion or apologies, he declined with a dismissive gesture that enraged spectators who wanted at least some acknowledgement of remorse. The hanging itself was conducted with the brutal efficiency typical of 18th century executions. No careful drop calculations to ensure quick neck breaks, just a platform removal that left Hutchinson strangling slowly at rope's end, his body convulsing as death arrived over minutes rather than seconds. The crowd watched in silence as the Mad Master's movements gradually stilled, as the man who had caused so much suffering experienced his own prolonged exit from life. But death didn't end Lewis Hutchinson's impact on Jamaica or on the dark catalogue of human evil. Edinburgh Castle stood as a monument to his crimes, and authorities faced the question of what to do with a building so thoroughly stained by atrocity. Initially, there were proposals to demolish it completely, to erase the physical reminder of Hutchinson's reign of terror. But property considerations and the sheer effort required to dismantle such a substantial structure delayed action. The castle developed a reputation that transcended normal historical infamy. Locals began reporting strange phenomena around the property, sounds that seemed to emerge from empty rooms, shadows that moved with no source to cast them, an oppressive atmosphere that made even daylight visits feel like descents into darkness. Whether these accounts reflected genuine supernatural activity, psychological projection of trauma onto the landscape, or simply the power of reputation to shape perception remains debatable. What isn't debatable is that Edinburgh Castle became synonymous with evil in the Jamaican consciousness. Hutchinson's story spread beyond Jamaica's shores through newspaper accounts and travelers' tales that painted increasingly lurid pictures of his crimes. In an era fascinated by Gothic horror, the Mad Master became a real-world counterpart to fictional monsters, proof that human evil could exceed anything imagination conjured. Writers and storytellers embellished his legend, adding details that may or may not have been accurate, but served to cement his place in the pantheon of history's most depraved killers. The true victim count remained uncertain, with estimates varying wildly based on which sources historians trusted. Some accounts suggested dozens of confirmed kills. Others claimed evidence pointed toward well over 100 victims destroyed within Edinburgh Castle's walls. The journals Hutchinson kept, while detailed, didn't provide complete tallies. Whether because he didn't record every killing or because some journals were never recovered remains unknown. This uncertainty about the full scope of his crimes adds another layer of horror to Hutchinson's legacy. For families of enslaved people who disappeared during his active years, closure was impossible. Without knowing whether their loved ones had fallen victim to the Mad Master or had met other fates, grief remained permanently suspended in terrible ambiguity. The colonial system that enabled Hutchinson's murder spree faced no real reckoning. Officials who had ignored evidence, who had failed to investigate despite abundant warnings, who had protected Hutchinson through willful blindness, none of them suffered consequences. His execution served as a convenient endpoint that allowed society to declare the problem solved without examining the structural failures that had permitted decades of unchecked killing. Modern scholars studying Hutchinson's case have identified him as one of history's earliest documented serial killers, a man whose crimes predated the terminology that would later be developed to categorize such predators. His methodical approach, his evolution from careful concealment to brazen display, his documented psychological detachment, all of these elements appear in contemporary profiles of serial murderers, suggesting that whatever drives such individuals transcends era and culture. Edinburgh Castle itself eventually fell into ruin, though the timeline of its decay remains somewhat unclear in historical records. Some accounts describe deliberate destruction in the years immediately following Hutchinson's execution. Others suggest it deteriorated gradually through neglect and deliberate avoidance. By the early 19th century, little remained beyond foundation stones and partial walls, with vegetation reclaiming the land that had witnessed so much suffering. But the location retained its dark reputation even after the physical structure disappeared. Throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, stories persisted about the site where Edinburgh Castle once stood. People claimed to hear sounds emerging from empty ground, to see figures moving through spaces where no one stood, to experience overwhelming dread when approaching the area. These accounts might be dismissed as folklore except for their remarkable consistency across generations and their persistence long after direct memory of Hutchinson's crimes had faded. The Mad Master story raises uncomfortable questions about human nature and societal structures that enable monsters to operate. Hutchinson wasn't a creature from darkness who appeared without warning. He was produced by and protected within a social system that valued certain lives so little that their systematic destruction went unpunished for decades. His crimes weren't aberrations but logical extensions of a colonial order built on brutality and dehumanization. Modern true crime enthusiasts studying historical cases often point to Lewis Hutchinson as an example of how incomplete the historical record remains for many serial killers, particularly those who operated in eras with less rigorous documentation and law enforcement. How many other Hutchinsons existed whose crimes went entirely unrecorded, whose victims disappeared into historical silence so complete that even their suffering left no trace? The name Lewis Hutchinson has faded from popular consciousness compared to later serial killers whose crimes received more extensive documentation and media coverage. But among historians of crime and those who study Jamaica's colonial period, the Mad Master of Edinburgh Castle remains a figure of enduring horrific fascination. A reminder that evil doesn't require supernatural origin, that human cruelty can exceed anything mythology imagined, and that the most terrifying monsters don't lurk in shadows but walk among us wearing respectable faces. His legacy lives on not in memorials or monuments, but in the cautionary tale his life represents. A warning about what happens when social structures value some humans so little that their destruction becomes invisible, when privilege shields predators from consequences, when communities choose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth. Edinburgh Castle may have crumbled into ruins, but the lessons of what happened within its walls remain urgently relevant. The Mad Master died on the gallows nearly 250 years ago, but the questions his crimes raise about justice, human nature, and societal responsibility continue echoing through centuries. And somewhere in Jamaica, in ground that once bore the weight of Edinburgh Castle's blood-stained stones, the earth remembers what happened there and what we allowed to happen by looking away. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Wolf of Hanover, Jasper Haimbeth and the Blood-Soaked Empire of the Hells Angels MC. They say evil doesn't announce itself. It arrives in leather and chrome, wearing a smile that could freeze your soul. There are monsters who wear masks, and then there are monsters who wear club patches. Jasper Haimbeth wasn't born a devil. He was forged into one, tempered by violence, sharpened by greed, and unleashed upon a world that would tremble at the roar of motorcycle engines. This is the story of a man who transformed a brotherhood into a butchering ground, who turned loyalty into a death sentence, and who painted the streets of Europe with the blood of anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. From the neon-lit brothels of Spain to the shadowed alleyways of Germany, Haimbeth didn't just break the law. He shattered lives, crushed bones, and extinguished futures with the casual indifference of a man who had long ago sold his humanity for power. What you're about to hear isn't just a crime story. It's a descent into the abyss, a journey through the twisted mind of a predator who wore brotherhood like a weapon and wielded death like a birthright. This is the chronicle of Jasper Haimbeth, the Wolf of Hanover, and the empire he built on screams. Evil doesn't emerge fully formed from the darkness. It gestates, it feeds, it grows in the cracks of broken childhoods and shattered dreams until it becomes something unrecognizable, something that can look you in the eye while ending your existence. Jasper Haimbeth entered this world in 1965, born into the gray, industrial sprawl of Hanover, Germany, a city still bearing the scars of war, still rebuilding itself from rubble and ruin. His early years remained shrouded in deliberate obscurity, a past he would later refuse to discuss, as though the boy he once was had been murdered to make room for the predator he would become. But those who knew him in those formative years speak of a child who learned too early that the world respects only one language: violence. Hanover in the 1970s was a city of contrasts. Gleaming reconstruction efforts stood alongside neighborhoods that festered with poverty, crime, and desperation. It was here, in the forgotten corners where society's rules bent and broke, that young Jasper discovered his calling. School held no interest for him. Education seemed a fool's game when the streets offered a different curriculum entirely. One taught with fists, knives, and the brutal arithmetic of survival. By his teenage years, Haimbeth had already cultivated a reputation. He wasn't the loudest voice in any room, but he was often the most dangerous. Where other young men postured and threatened, Jasper acted. Where others drew lines, he crossed them without hesitation. There was something unsettling in his eyes even then, a coldness that suggested the absence of something fundamental, something human. The motorcycle clubs that prowled through Germany's underbelly in the late 1970s and early 1980s noticed him. These weren't weekend warriors playing dress-up on their bikes. These were organizations built on criminal enterprise, on drugs and prostitution and protection rackets. They were families bound not by blood but by violence, and they recognized in young Jasper Haimbeth a kindred spirit, or perhaps something worse. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club had established its presence in Germany, transplanting the notorious brand from American soil to European streets. They promised brotherhood, respect, and power to those willing to earn their colors. For Haimbeth, this wasn't just an opportunity, it was a destiny. He didn't join the club seeking belonging or community. He joined because he recognized it as the perfect vehicle for his ambitions, a legitimate-seeming facade behind which he could build an empire of suffering. His initiation wasn't documented in any official record, but the whispers that filtered through the criminal underworld painted a picture of brutality that shocked even hardened criminals. Prospective members of the Hells Angels had to prove themselves, had to demonstrate their willingness to commit acts that would forever separate them from normal society. Hainbith didn't just meet these requirements. He exceeded them with an enthusiasm that disturbed his sponsors. The early 1980s saw Jasper Hainbith transform from prospect to patch holder, earning the right to wear the Death's Head insignia that marked him as a full member of the Hells Angels. But he wasn't content to simply belong. Contentment was for the weak, for those who lacked vision. Hainbith possessed vision in abundance, a dark, blood-soaked vision of control and dominance that would eventually position him at the apex of the organization's European operations. He studied the club's power structure with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. He identified weaknesses, exploited fractures, and systematically removed obstacles to his advancement. Some obstacles were removed through political maneuvering within the club. Others simply disappeared, their bodies never recovered, their fates becoming cautionary tales whispered among members who understood that challenging Jasper Hainbith meant inviting death. By the mid-1990s, Hainbith had clawed his way to a leadership position within the Hanover Charter. This wasn't merely an honorific title. It represented real power, control over territory, operations, and lives. Under his guidance, the Hanover chapter transformed into one of the most feared and profitable criminal organizations in Germany. Drug trafficking expanded exponentially. Prostitution rings spread like cancer through the city. Protection rackets ensnared legitimate businesses, forcing owners to pay tribute or face consequences that ranged from property destruction to personal annihilation. But Hainbith's ambitions extended far beyond the gray streets of Hanover. His gaze turned southward, toward the sun-drenched coasts of Spain, where opportunities bloomed like poisonous flowers. The Spanish island of Majorca, with its thriving tourist industry and strategic location, represented a gold mine for organized crime. Drugs flowed through the Mediterranean like water, and Hainbith intended to control that flow. The expansion into Spain required a particular kind of ruthlessness. Majorca already had established criminal networks, local gangs, rival motorcycle clubs, and sophisticated organized crime syndicates that had no intention of yielding territory to German interlopers. Hainbith understood that negotiation was pointless. Respect in this world wasn't earned through diplomacy, it was seized through overwhelming force. The bodies began accumulating almost immediately. Rival gang members were found in ditches with multiple gunshot wounds, their faces beaten beyond recognition as a message. Local businessmen who refused to cooperate with the Hells Angels' demands discovered their establishments firebombed in the dead of night. Witnesses who spoke to police found themselves targeted, their lives and the lives of their families hanging by threads that Hainbith could sever at will. One particularly brutal incident exemplified Hainbith's methodology. A local gang leader, a man named Miguel Ortega who controlled a significant portion of Majorca's drug distribution, had publicly vowed to resist the Hells Angels' encroachment. Ortega was found 3 weeks later in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Palma. The scene that greeted investigators was something from a nightmare. Ortega had been tortured extensively before his death. His fingers had been removed one by one. Burn marks covered his torso. His teeth had been extracted with pliers. The final indignity came when his killers decapitated him and left his head mounted on a spike as a warning to anyone else considering resistance. Hainbith never faced charges for Ortega's murder. No witnesses came forward. No evidence directly connected him to the crime. But everyone in Majorca's criminal underworld understood exactly who had ordered the execution. That was precisely the point. Fear became Hainbith's most effective weapon, more powerful than any gun or knife. Fear kept people silent. Fear maintained control. Fear built empires. By the late 1990s, Jasper Hainbith had achieved what many thought impossible. He had established himself as the undisputed leader of the Hells Angels' European operations, controlling a criminal network that stretched from Germany through Eastern Europe and down into Spain. Money flowed into his coffers from dozens of illegal enterprises. Politicians and police officers found themselves on his payroll, corrupted by bribes or terrified into compliance by threats. But empires built on blood have a peculiar quality. They demand constant feeding. Violence begets violence. Each body creates relatives seeking revenge. Each conquered territory spawns resistance. Hainbeth had climbed to the summit of the criminal world, but the summit was slippery with blood, and the fall would be long and brutal. The man who stared back from mirrors in luxury villas and penthouse apartments bore little resemblance to the street kid from Hanover. Jasper Hainbeth had transformed himself into something that inspired terror across an entire continent. He dressed in expensive clothes, dined at exclusive restaurants, and moved through society with the confidence of someone untouchable. But beneath the veneer of sophistication, beneath the businessman's facade, the monster remained. The monster that had tasted blood and found it sweet. The monster that viewed human life as currency to be spent in pursuit of power. The monster that would soon discover that even the most carefully constructed empires eventually crumble, usually crushing their architects in the collapse. Power corrupts, they say, but that's only half the truth. Power reveals. It strips away the pretense of civilization and exposes the raw, writhing darkness that lurks beneath. For Jasper Hainbeth, power didn't corrupt, it liberated. It freed him to indulge every violent impulse, every sadistic urge, without consequence or restraint. The Hells Angels organization under Hainbeth's leadership became something unprecedented in the world of motorcycle clubs. Previous leaders had maintained a certain code, a twisted honor among thieves that set boundaries on behavior. Hainbeth recognized such codes as weakness, obstacles to be discarded. Under his rule, the only code was absolute obedience, and the penalty for disobedience was always the same: death, often preceded by suffering that would haunt witnesses for the remainder of their lives. The prostitution network Hainbeth controlled sprawled across multiple countries, a spider's web of human misery that generated millions in annual revenue. Young women, some barely legal, others tragically younger, were recruited, trafficked, and enslaved in brothels from Berlin to Barcelona. These weren't willing sex workers making autonomous choices. These were prisoners held through violence, addiction, and psychological torture. The stories that emerged from survivors painted a hellish picture. Women were beaten regularly to maintain compliance. Those who attempted escape were hunted down and made examples of in front of the others. One particularly horrific account described how a 19-year-old Ukrainian woman named Oksana had tried to flee a brothel in Hamburg. Hainbeth's enforcers found her within hours. They brought her back and assembled all the other women in the building's main room. What happened next was theater, a performance designed to embed absolute terror into every witness. Oksana was tied to a chair. For hours, Hainbeth's men took turns beating her, while she screamed for mercy that would never come. They broke her fingers one by one. They carved symbols into her skin with heated knives. They violated her repeatedly while the other women were forced to watch. When Oksana finally died from the trauma and blood loss, her body was left in the common area for 3 days as a reminder. The women who survived that night were never the same. Their spirits had been murdered just as surely as Oksana's body had been destroyed. They became automatons, hollow-eyed shells who service clients with mechanical detachment, too traumatized to even contemplate resistance. This was Hainbeth's genius for control. He didn't just threaten violence, he demonstrated it with such overwhelming brutality that further threats became unnecessary. The drug trafficking operation ran with similar ruthlessness. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and synthetic drugs flooded through Hainbeth's network, poisoning communities across Europe. The Hells Angels controlled every stage of the supply chain, from importation to street distribution. Anyone attempting to operate independently in their territory was eliminated with extreme prejudice. A dealer named Klaus Friedman made the fatal mistake of selling cocaine in Hamburg without paying tribute to the Hells Angels. Friedman was a small-time operator, barely scratching out a living, but Hainbeth couldn't tolerate even minor infractions. Tolerance bred disrespect, and disrespect bred challenges to authority. Friedman disappeared on a Tuesday evening. His girlfriend reported him missing, but police investigation yielded nothing initially. 3 weeks later, hikers in a forest outside Hamburg discovered what remained of Klaus Friedman. He had been buried alive, placed in a coffin-sized wooden box and interred in a shallow grave. The true horror became apparent when investigators examined the inside of the box. Friedman had regained consciousness while buried. The scratch marks on the wood and the splinters embedded under his fingernails told a story of unimaginable terror. A man clawing desperately at his prison, suffocating slowly in the darkness, knowing he would die alone and unmourned. Heimbeth's signature could be found in the psychological dimension of the torture. It wasn't enough to simply kill competitors. They had to die in ways that would haunt the imagination of anyone who heard the story. Fear spread like ripples from these executions, creating zones of absolute control where even thinking about challenging the Hells Angels seemed suicidal. Rival motorcycle clubs suffered particularly brutal fates. The Bandidos, longtime enemies of the Hells Angels, attempted to establish a presence in Heimbeth's territory during the early 2000s. The resulting conflict became known in German criminal circles as the Club War, though war suggests some degree of parity between combatants. This was systematic extermination. Bandidos members began disappearing regularly. Some were found dead, their bodies bearing the marks of prolonged torture. Cigarette burns, missing extremities, signs of beating so severe that bones had been pulverized. Others simply vanished, presumed dead but never confirmed, leaving families in agonizing uncertainty. One attack demonstrated Heimbeth's escalating brutality with terrifying clarity. A Bandidos clubhouse in Dusseldorf was hosting a party on a Saturday night. Approximately 30 members and their associates were inside, drinking, celebrating, believing themselves safe in their stronghold. Shortly after midnight, a truck crashed through the building's front entrance. Armed men poured through the breach, guns blazing. The massacre lasted less than 10 minutes. When police arrived, they found 8 dead bodies and more than a dozen wounded. The survivors described attackers wearing Hells Angels insignia, methodically executing anyone they encountered. Witnesses reported that the attackers weren't panicked or rushed. They moved with cold efficiency, shooting victims multiple times to ensure death, pausing to reload, then continuing their work. Heimbeth was questioned about the attack but never charged. The usual obstacles materialized. Witnesses recanted their statements, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and surviving victims suddenly developed amnesia about identifying details. The message had been delivered with devastating effectiveness. Challenge the Hells Angels, and not even your clubhouse would protect you. The corruption Heimbeth cultivated extended deep into legitimate institutions. Police officers on his payroll provided advance warning of raids, destroyed evidence, and falsified reports. Politicians received generous campaign contributions in exchange for looking the other way when Hells Angels activities generated complaints. Lawyers specializing in criminal defense found themselves representing club members repeatedly, often securing acquittals or reduced sentences through means that had nothing to do with justice. This network of corruption insulated Heimbeth from consequences for years. He operated with near impunity, building his criminal empire while maintaining the facade of a legitimate businessman. He owned properties, investments, and businesses that appeared lawful on paper but served as money laundering operations for his drug profits. The violence wasn't limited to criminals and rivals. Innocent people who accidentally witnessed crimes, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or who simply irritated Heimbeth on a personal level found themselves targeted. A journalist named Werner Schmidt wrote an investigative piece about the Hells Angels' activities in Hamburg. The article was well-researched and damning, exposing connections between the club and local politicians. Schmidt received threatening phone calls almost immediately. Anonymous voices described where his children attended school, what route his wife took to work, the layout of his home. When Schmidt refused to be intimidated and continued his investigation, the threats escalated to action. His car exploded in his driveway one morning. Fortunately, Schmidt wasn't inside at the time, but the message was unmistakable. He fled Germany with his family, abandoning his career and his home to escape Hainbeth's reach. Even then, the journalist looked over his shoulder for years, never quite believing he was safe, never quite recovering from the trauma of being hunted by a monster in human skin. By 2010, Jasper Hainbeth controlled an empire that generated an estimated 50 million euros annually from illegal activities. He lived in a mansion in Mallorca, surrounded by luxury and insulated by layers of violence. He had won. He had climbed over mountains of corpses to reach the summit of the criminal world, and from that vantage point, he believed himself untouchable. But the screams of his victims were echoing through halls of power far from Mallorca's beaches. Law enforcement agencies across Europe had been building cases, pooling resources, preparing for a coordinated strike that would bring Hainbeth's empire crashing down. The Wolf of Hanover had grown fat and comfortable, forgetting the fundamental truth that eventually catches every predator. The hunt never truly ends. Every empire contains the seeds of its own destruction. For Hainbeth, those seeds were planted in the very violence that had built his kingdom. Bodies created evidence. Witnesses, no matter how terrified, could still break. Money trails, despite elaborate laundering schemes, could still be followed. And eventually, the weight of accumulated crimes becomes too heavy for even the most elaborate criminal infrastructure to support. The turning point came in 2012, though Hainbeth wouldn't recognize it immediately. A low-level enforcer named Thomas Brandt was arrested in Berlin on weapons charges, a seemingly minor incident in the grand scheme of Hainbeth's operations. But Brandt had witnessed things, terrible things, and the prospect of spending decades in prison for loyalty to a man who viewed him as disposable proved too much. Brandt began talking to prosecutors. At first, they were skeptical. Members of motorcycle clubs rarely cooperated with law enforcement, bound by codes of silence enforced through threat of death. But Brandt was different. He had reached a breaking point, haunted by nightmares of the things he had done and the things he had seen. His testimony wouldn't just be hearsay or speculation. He could provide details, dates, locations, and most critically, evidence. The prosecutor assigned to Brandt's debriefing was a woman named Greta Hoffman, a career criminal investigator who had spent 15 years building cases against organized crime. She had seen cooperating witnesses before, but Brandt was different. The horrors he described, murders, tortures, trafficking operations, exceeded even her experienced imagination. She listened as Brandt detailed how he had participated in beating a man to death with baseball bats because the victim had inadvertently insulted Hainbeth during a business meeting. She documented his account of disposing of bodies in industrial acid drums. She recorded his description of how the prostitution network operated, how young women were kept compliant through drugs and violence. Each revelation added another piece to a massive criminal puzzle. Hoffman coordinated with law enforcement agencies across Europe, German Federal Police, Spanish Guardia Civil, Interpol, Europol. They began assembling a case that would encompass not just Hainbeth, but the entire upper leadership structure of the Hells Angels European organization. The investigation had to proceed with extreme caution. Hainbeth's network of corrupted officials extended into police departments and government offices. Information leaked to the wrong person could compromise the entire operation, potentially getting witnesses killed and allowing targets to flee. Hoffman and her team operated in absolute secrecy, compartmentalizing information and trusting only a handful of verified personnel. Surveillance operations commenced across multiple countries. Wiretaps captured conversations discussing drug shipments, murders, and money laundering. Hidden cameras documented meetings between Hainbeth and his lieutenants. Financial investigators traced money through shell corporations, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses, mapping out an empire that generated wealth through human suffering. Other witnesses began emerging, emboldened by news of Brandt's cooperation. A former prostitute who had escaped the network provided devastating testimony about the trafficking operations. A club member facing separate charges agreed to testify in exchange for protection. Each new witness added layers of evidence, creating a prosecutorial case that grew stronger by the week. Hainbeth, oblivious to the net closing around him, continued operating as though invincible. He threw lavish parties at his Mallorca mansion, attended by criminals, corrupt officials, and socialites who either didn't know or didn't care about the source of his wealth. He expanded operations, opening new brothels and establishing drug distribution networks in Eastern Europe. The violence continued unabated, competitors eliminated, witnesses silenced, lessons taught through brutality. A particularly heinous murder during this period demonstrated that Heimbeth's capacity for cruelty had not diminished with age or success. A club member named Rolf Schneider had been skimming money from drug proceeds, stealing relatively small amounts but committing the ultimate betrayal nonetheless. When Heimbeth discovered the theft, Schneider's fate was sealed. Schneider was kidnapped from his apartment in Hamburg. His wife and young daughter were home at the time, forced to watch as masked men dragged him away, his screams echoing through the building. Neighbors who heard the commotion kept their doors locked and their mouths shut, understanding that intervening meant sharing Schneider's fate. What happened to Rolf Schneider over the following 48 hours remains partially unknown. What is known comes from forensic evidence and the nightmares of those who witnessed or participated. Schneider was taken to an isolated warehouse. He was beaten systematically, each blow carefully calibrated to maximize pain without causing immediate death. His captors demanded he confess to the theft, which he did immediately, but confession wasn't sufficient. This was about sending a message, about demonstrating the consequences of betrayal. They broke his legs with sledgehammers. They burned him with welding torches. They cut off his ears and made him swallow them. Throughout the ordeal, Schneider begged for mercy, for death, for anything to end the agony. His torturers laughed. When they finally tired of their sport, they doused Schneider in gasoline and set him ablaze while he was still alive. His charred remains were found 3 days later in an industrial dumpster. The medical examiner's report stated that Schneider had been alive when the fire started, his lungs full of smoke and superheated air. He had died screaming, immolated as punishment for a crime that had netted him perhaps 10,000 euros. Schneider's murder would become one of the central charges in the eventual prosecution. Witnesses had seen his abduction. Forensic evidence linked the murder to known Hells Angels facilities. Cell phone records placed several of Heimbeth's enforcers at the scene. The crime was so egregious, so elaborately cruel, that it exemplified everything prosecutors needed to demonstrate about the organization's nature. By late 2012, the investigation had accumulated thousands of pages of evidence. Witness testimony, surveillance transcripts, financial records, forensic reports. Hoffman and her team were ready to strike, but the operation required perfect timing. They needed to arrest dozens of suspects simultaneously across multiple countries, ensuring that no one received warning and fled. The date was set for January 24, 2013. More than 300 police officers across Germany, Spain, and several other European nations prepared for coordinated raids. Aircraft stood ready to transport arrestees. Courts had processed dozens of arrest warrants. Safe houses were established for witnesses who would need protection from retaliation. Heimbeth spent the evening of January 23rd at a restaurant in Palma, dining with associates, discussing business as casually as legitimate executives might discuss quarterly earnings. He had no idea that hundreds of law enforcement officers were, at that very moment, studying photographs of him, reviewing arrest protocols, and preparing to dismantle everything he had built. The Wolf of Hanover finished his meal, paid his bill with cash peeled from a roll that represented drug profits and prostitution proceeds, and returned to his mansion. He slept peacefully that night, comfortable in his bed, secure in his power. It would be the last peaceful night Jasper Heimbeth would ever experience. At dawn, the hammer of justice would fall with devastating force, and the empire built on screams would begin its collapse. The surveillance teams watching Heimbeth's mansion reported his arrival home. They confirmed his presence inside. Everything was in position. Around Europe, officers waited for the synchronized signal that would launch Operation Roadrunner, the largest coordinated action against motorcycle gang crime in European history. At 6 a.m. on January 24, 2013, that signal came. Across the continent, doors were breached, weapons were drawn, and suspects were apprehended. In Majorca, Spanish police approached Heimbeth's mansion with the rising sun at their backs. The Wolf of Hanover was about to discover that even the most vicious predators can become prey. The raid on Heimbeth's mansion unfolded with military precision. Heavily armed Spanish police breached the gates at exactly 6:03 a.m., moving through the property in coordinated teams. Officers expected resistance. Heimbeth and his associates were known to be armed and dangerous, but the speed and overwhelming force of the operation left no time for defense. Heimbeth was dragged from his bed, thrown to the floor, and handcuffed while he was still disoriented from sleep. The man who had inspired terror across an entire continent found himself face down on marble flooring, surrounded by officers with weapons trained on him, experiencing powerlessness for the first time in decades. His shouts of protest, his demands to speak with his lawyers, his threats, none of it mattered. The empire had fallen. Across Europe, similar scenes played out. 63 suspects were arrested within hours. Chapter presidents, enforcers, financial operatives, corrupt officials who had facilitated Heimbeth's operations. The coordination was flawless. Not a single primary target escaped. Safe houses were raided, yielding drugs, weapons, financial records, and other evidence. Brothels were liberated, freeing dozens of women from sexual slavery. The media descended on the story like hungry wolves. Headlines screamed about the arrest of Europe's most dangerous motorcycle gang leader. News broadcasts featured footage of Heimbeth being perp-walked in handcuffs, the mighty predator reduced to a prisoner. Journalists competed to expose the most shocking details of his crimes. Prosecutors held a press conference detailing the charges. The list was staggering: multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, trafficking in persons, drug trafficking, weapons violations, money laundering, racketeering, and dozens of other offenses. Hoffman stood at the podium and methodically described the evidence, painting a picture of a criminal organization that had operated with unprecedented brutality. Heimbeth's initial response was defiance. He refused to speak with investigators, referring all questions to his legal team. His attorneys mounted an aggressive defense, challenging the legality of evidence collection, attacking witness credibility, and arguing that their client was a legitimate businessman unfairly targeted because of his motorcycle club affiliation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony placed Heimbeth at murder scenes. Wiretap recordings captured him discussing criminal activities. Financial records demonstrated money laundering operations. Forensic evidence linked him to torture sites. The prosecution had built a case so comprehensive, so thoroughly documented, that even Heimbeth's expensive legal team struggled to counter it. The trial began in 2014 in a heavily fortified courtroom in Germany. Security was unprecedented. Metal detectors, armed guards, barriers separating the public gallery from the proceedings. Witnesses testified from behind screens, their identities protected from the dozens of Hell's Angels members who attended daily, their presence designed to intimidate. Thomas Brandt took the stand and, for 3 days, detailed the inner workings of Heimbeth's organization. He described murders he had witnessed, crimes he had participated in, and the culture of absolute obedience Heimbeth had cultivated. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility viciously, highlighting his own criminal history, but Brandt remained composed. He acknowledged his guilt, admitted his crimes, and accepted his role in the horror. But he also pointed directly at Heimbeth and stated clearly that every action he had taken was under orders from the leadership. The escaped trafficking victim, now in protective custody under a new identity, provided testimony that left the courtroom in stunned silence. She described the night Oksana had been murdered, the systematic violence that kept women enslaved, the customers who paid for access to brutalized victims. Several jurors were visibly moved to tears. Heimbeth sat expressionless, refusing to show any emotion, but the damage to his defense was catastrophic. Forensic experts explained how Rolf Schneider had been tortured and murdered. They presented evidence linking the crime to Heimbeth's organization. Tool marks matching equipment found in a Hell's Angels-owned warehouse, DNA evidence, witness testimony placing suspects at the scene. The medical examiner described Schneider's injuries in clinical detail that somehow made them even more horrific. Week after week, the prosecution built its case. They presented evidence of drug trafficking operations that had distributed tons of narcotics across Europe. They documented prostitution networks that had enslaved hundreds of women. They detailed protection rackets, murder conspiracies, weapons trafficking, and countless other crimes. The defense attempted to present Hambeth as a successful businessman who happened to be a member of a motorcycle club, persecuted by authorities who didn't understand biker culture. They argued that the Hells Angels were a legitimate organization, that any crimes committed by individual members couldn't be attributed to leadership, that their client was being scapegoated. The jury didn't buy it. How could they, when the evidence was so overwhelming, when witness after witness described Hambeth's personal involvement in ordering murders, directing trafficking operations, and building a criminal empire? In 2015, after months of testimony and deliberation, the verdict came down. Guilty on multiple counts of murder, guilty of trafficking, guilty of drug distribution, guilty of racketeering. The courtroom erupted. Hells Angels members shouted threats and curses. Victims' family members wept with relief. Security officers moved quickly to restore order. The sentencing hearing was brief. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over numerous organized crime cases, addressed Hambeth directly. She spoke about the suffering he had caused, the lives destroyed, the families shattered. She noted his complete lack of remorse, his refusal to accept responsibility. Then she pronounced sentence: life imprisonment without possibility of parole for 25 years. Hambeth showed no reaction. He was escorted from the courtroom in shackles, disappearing into the German prison system where he would spend the remainder of his life. The Wolf of Hanover had been caged, but the reckoning extended beyond Hambeth personally. Dozens of co-defendants received lengthy sentences. The Hells Angels' European operations were decimated. Properties were seized through asset forfeiture. Clubs were forced to close. The organization that had terrorized communities across the continent was broken. Other motorcycle clubs noted the outcome carefully. Law enforcement had demonstrated that no criminal organization, regardless of its reputation for violence, was truly untouchable. The era of impunity was over. The trafficking victims began the long, difficult process of recovery. Many would never fully heal from their trauma. Psychological scars from their enslavement would haunt them for life. But they were free, no longer property of monsters like Hambeth. Counseling programs, victim advocacy organizations, and social services worked to help them rebuild shattered lives. Families of murder victims found some measure of closure, though nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, spouses who had lost partners. They had watched justice delivered, had seen the man responsible for their suffering held accountable. It wasn't enough, but it was something. In prison, Hambeth adapted to his new reality. The violence that had defined his life now worked against him. Other inmates knew his crimes, knew about the women he had trafficked, the murders he had ordered. Child predators and traffickers occupy the lowest rung of prison social hierarchy, despised even by murderers and drug dealers. Hambeth required protective custody, spending 23 hours daily in isolation for his own safety. The mighty Wolf of Hanover, who had commanded fear and loyalty, who had built an empire through brutality, now lived in a cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet. No luxury villa, no expensive restaurants, no power, just concrete walls, bars, and the knowledge that he would die behind them. His appeals were systematically rejected. The evidence was too strong, the procedures too carefully followed, the verdict too justified. European courts confirmed his conviction and sentence. Hambeth would never again walk free. The saga of Jasper Hambeth stands as a testament to both human evil and the eventual triumph of justice. For years, he operated with near impunity, building an empire on suffering, believing himself untouchable. He murdered, enslaved, trafficked, and destroyed countless lives without apparent consequence. But consequences came, as they always do for men who mistake temporary power for permanent immunity. The bodies accumulated, the evidence mounted, the witnesses found courage, and eventually the predator was caught and caged. Hambeth's story serves as a warning. The Wolf of Hanover learned, too late, that every empire built on screams must eventually fall, usually crushing its architect in the collapse. Justice may be slow, but it is relentless. Even monsters who wear brotherhood as camouflage, who wrap violence in club colors, who transform loyalty into a weapon, even they eventually face reckoning. In his cell, removed from the world he once terrorized, Jasper Hambeth has nothing but time to reflect on the choices that brought him there. Whether he experiences remorse remains unknown and ultimately irrelevant. His victims will never recover fully. The families he destroyed will never heal completely. The suffering he caused ripples outward still, but the screams have stopped. The empire has fallen, and the Wolf of Hanover will die in prison, powerless and forgotten. Precisely the fate he deserves. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Devil's Midwife, Catherine Monvoisin La Voisin. They called her the midwife. They should have called her the Reaper. Imagine a woman whose hands brought life into the world, then snuffed it out before the first breath. A fortune teller who poisoned Paris from within, whose parlor smelled of incense and burning flesh, where noblewomen whispered their darkest desires and babies vanished into the flames. Catherine Monvoisin didn't just kill for profit. She built an empire on infant bones and arsenic, convincing the highest echelons of French society that murder was simply another service, like palm reading or love charms. For 3 decades, she turned death into commerce, transforming her home into an abattoir dressed as a temple. This is the story of La Voisin, the sorceress of Saint Denis, whose hands are stained with the blood of over 2,500 victims. And when the authorities finally dragged her secrets into the light, they discovered something far more terrifying than one woman's depravity. They discovered that Paris itself had been rotting from the inside, poisoned by its own elite, 1 cup of wine at a time. Paris, 1640. The year Catherine de Chaise drew her first breath, the city already stank of death. But this wasn't the clean death of old age or the swift death of battle. This was the slow death, the creeping death, the kind that crawled through the narrow streets of Saint Denis and settled into the bones of buildings like damp rot. The city was a maze of shadows where anything could be bought, where anyone could disappear, where women like Catherine's mother, poor, desperate, forgotten, learned early that survival demanded compromise. Catherine grew up watching, always watching. She watched her mother's hands, red and cracked from washing other people's clothes. She watched the fine ladies who walked past their hovel, their silk skirts whispering secrets of a world Catherine could only imagine. She watched the midwives who came and went from the tenement houses, their leather bags heavy with implements, their faces carved from stone. And she watched the babies, so many babies, some who lived, many who didn't, all of them helpless and small and utterly dependent on the mercy of adults who often had none to spare. By the time Catherine was 12, she'd learned the most valuable lesson the streets could teach. Everyone wants something. Everyone needs something. And the person who can provide those things, no matter how dark, will never go hungry. Her first husband, Antoine Monvoisin, was a jeweler, a weak man with soft hands and softer ambitions. He gave her a name, Monvoisin, which she would make infamous. He gave her children, which she viewed as investments. And he gave her respectability, which she would use as camouflage for 3 decades of horror. But Antoine was a failure at business, and Catherine refused to be dragged down by his incompetence. While he fumbled with metals and gemstones, she began cultivating a different kind of craft. She became a midwife, not because she loved children, She would prove she felt nothing for them at all. But because midwifery opened doors, it brought her into the private chambers of women at their most vulnerable, their most desperate, their most willing to pay for discretion. Women in labor told secrets. Women facing unwanted pregnancies needed solutions. Women trapped in loveless marriages craved escape. Catherine provided all of it. Her house on Rue Beauregard became a destination. At first, she offered legitimate services: deliveries, herbal remedies, fortune-telling readings that combined enough truth with theatrical mysticism to build a reputation. She was good at it. She had a presence, a commanding voice, a way of looking into someone's eyes that made them believe she could see their future written in the stars. But fortune-telling was just the beginning. The women who came to her didn't want to know their futures. They wanted to change them. They wanted the husband to die so they could remarry. They wanted the lover to become obsessed. They wanted the rival to disappear. They wanted the inheritance to come early. They wanted the inconvenient pregnancy to vanish. And Catherine, always watching, always learning, realized she could give them everything they desired. The transformation of her home began slowly. The front rooms remained respectable. Velvet curtains, polished tables, cards for reading, herbs for healing. But the back rooms, the rooms where no client ever ventured uninvited, became something else entirely. She installed a furnace, large and hungry, its iron door opening onto darkness. She built an altar, black cloth draped over stone, where she performed ceremonies that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with destruction. She learned about poisons, arsenic, first, always arsenic. It was called inheritance powder in the streets, and for good reason. Colorless, tasteless, it could be mixed into wine, baked into bread, stirred into soup. Administered in small doses over time, it mimicked natural illness. Stomach pains, vomiting, weakness, death. The doctors would nod sagely and speak of bad humors, weak constitutions, God's will. No one suspected murder because everyone was already dying of something in 17th century Paris. She learned about aconite, extracted from wolfsbane, fast-acting, devastating, causing the heart to seize and the lungs to freeze. She learned about belladonna, which dilated the pupils and brought hallucinations before the final darkness. She learned about antimony, lead, mercury, each with its own signature, its own timeline, its own particular horror. But poisons were just tools. Catherine's real genius was in understanding human nature. She knew that people wanted to believe in magic. They wanted to believe that a ritual, an incantation, a ceremony could bend the universe to their will. So she gave them theater. She dressed in flowing robes and spoke in languages that sounded ancient and powerful. Gibberish, mostly, mixed with Latin phrases she'd memorized without understanding. She burned incense that filled the rooms with smoke, making everything dreamlike and otherworldly. She used sleight of hand, mirrors, accomplices who whispered information she could present as supernatural knowledge. And at the center of all this performance, hidden inside the spectacle, was murder. Real, methodical, profitable murder. Her clients came from everywhere. Shopkeepers' wives who wanted to be widows. Servants who wanted their masters dead. Merchants who wanted competitors eliminated. But increasingly, her clientele came from higher stations. Minor nobles, court officials, ladies-in-waiting at Versailles. These women had more to lose, more to gain, and infinitely more money to spend. For them, Catherine expanded her services. She called them black masses, blasphemous ceremonies conducted on her altar, perversions of Catholic ritual that promised dark miracles. She would have a woman lie naked on the stone while a defrocked priest named Etienne Gibourg, himself a monster, would chant over her body, invoking demons and pagan gods. The centerpiece of these ceremonies, the fuel that supposedly powered the dark magic, was innocent blood, the blood of infants. Catherine had built a network. Pregnant women who couldn't keep their babies would come to her, or she would find them. Desperate girls, terrified women, anyone carrying an unwanted child. She promised help. She promised discretion. She promised that the problem would disappear. And it did. but not through adoption or placement in foundling hospitals. Catherine had discovered that dead babies were valuable. Their blood could be sold to nobles who believed it enhanced love potions. Their tiny bodies could be rendered down, their fat used in ointments and candles that supposedly held magical properties. Their ashes could be mixed into powders meant to curse enemies or bind lovers. The killing method was brutally simple. Some infants she strangled immediately after delivery, her hands closing around throats barely wider than her thumb. Others she would throw into the furnace alive, their screams swallowed by the roar of flames and the thickness of the walls. She did this with the same casual efficiency that other women used to pluck chickens or gut fish. No ceremony, no hesitation, no mercy. Marie Boss, one of her associates, would later confess that they had murdered more than 2,500 babies. 2,500 small lives, extinguished before they could draw enough breath to cry. Their bodies destroyed so thoroughly that no evidence remained except the memories of the women who had participated in their deaths. Catherine's operation grew. She recruited other fortune tellers, other midwives, other women who understood that there was profit in darkness. They worked in concert, referring clients to each other, sharing techniques, creating a network of death that stretched across Paris like a spider's web. And at the center of that web sat Catherine Monvoisin, La Voisin now, the name everyone used, the name that meant power, growing wealthy and bold. She bought fine dresses. She hosted elaborate dinners. She lived openly, lavishly, her success visible for anyone to see. But somehow, impossibly, she remained untouched by law. Perhaps because too many important people were her clients. Perhaps because the authorities themselves were compromised. Perhaps because Paris had grown so accustomed to sudden deaths that no one thought to look for patterns. Or perhaps because Catherine was simply better at murder than anyone else in the city. Her home became infamous in whispered conversations. The place where impossible things happened, where prayers were answered in blood, where death arrived wrapped in promises. Women would arrive in covered carriages at midnight, their faces hidden, their purses heavy. They would leave hours later, lighter in both weight and conscience, carrying vials of poison disguised as perfume, powders wrapped in silk, instructions for administering death disguised as recipes. And Catherine would smile, count her money, and stoke the furnace for the next offering. The year was 1665, and Catherine Monvoisin had perfected her craft. She was no longer just a midwife or a fortune teller. She had become something far more dangerous, a broker of death, a consultant for murder, a woman who could make problems disappear with the same ease that others arranged dinner parties. Her reputation had spread beyond the slums of Saint Denis and into the glittering halls of Versailles itself. The nobility, it turned out, had just as many enemies as the poor. They simply had better resources for eliminating them. Catherine's consultation room had evolved into something resembling a physician's office, if that physician specialized in endings rather than healings. She kept detailed notes, never names, she was too careful for that, but descriptions, doses, timelines. Each client received a customized solution, tailored to their specific needs and circumstances. A wife who wanted her husband dead but couldn't risk suspicion? Catherine would provide a slow-acting poison that mimicked consumption. The man would waste away over months, coughing blood, growing weaker, while his wife played the devoted caretaker. By the time he died, everyone would speak of how brave she'd been, how devoted, how tragic her loss. A mistress who wanted her lover's wife removed from the picture, Catherine offered faster solutions. Arsenic in the woman's morning chocolate, mercury salts in her evening wine. Death would come within days, sudden enough to shock but common enough to avoid investigation. Food poisoning, the doctors would say, bad meat, tainted water, an act of God. God had nothing to do with it. But Catherine's most elaborate service, the one that commanded the highest prices and attracted the most dangerous clientele, remained the Black Mass. These ceremonies had become legendary in Paris's underground, whispered about in alcoves and private salons, desired by women who believed they'd exhausted every conventional option. The ritual required preparation. Catherine would spend days beforehand gathering the necessary components. She needed the defrocked priest, Giborg, whose appetite for sacrilege matched her own appetite for profit. She needed the pregnant women, which her network of associates continually supplied. She needed the altar, freshly draped in black cloth stolen from churches. And she needed the clients themselves, wealthy women desperate enough to participate in blasphemy. The ceremony always followed the same pattern, a perverse inversion of Catholic Mass that would have made the Inquisition salivate. The client would arrive after dark, her identity concealed by a hooded cloak. Catherine would lead her through the front rooms, past the legitimate business of fortune-telling and herb-selling, into the back chambers where the real work occurred. The room would be thick with incense. Not the pleasant church variety, but something heavier, more cloying, mixed with hashish and other substances that made the air itself feel drugged. Candles provided the only light, their flames casting enormous shadows on the walls. The furnace would be burning already, its heat turning the space into something hellish. The client would disrobe and lie on the altar. Her body became the table for this obscene communion. Giborg, dressed in stolen vestments turned inside out to reveal their black linings, would begin the inverted Massachusetts. He would place a chalice on the woman's stomach, between her breasts, sometimes on her forehead. He would recite prayers backward, replace the name of Christ with the names of demons. Astaroth, Asmodeus, Beelzebub, and then Catherine would bring in the infant. Sometimes the mother would be present, held in another room, too weak from childbirth to resist or drugged into compliance. Sometimes Catherine would use a baby obtained from her network, a child whose mother believed it was being given to a foundling hospital or adopted by a wealthy family. The infant might be hours old or days old, but always unbaptized. That detail mattered to the women who paid for these ceremonies. Unbaptized meant unsaved, which meant the blood held more power. What happened next occurred with practiced efficiency. Giborg would hold the baby above the chalice. Catherine would hand him the blade, always sharp, always clean, always ready. The killing was never prolonged. A single cut across the throat, deep and decisive. The blood would drain into the cup, mixing with wine that had already been blessed backward, dedicated to darkness instead of light. The baby's cries would stop almost immediately. The small body would be handed back to Catherine, who would carry it to the furnace like a woman carrying firewood. The iron door would open. The flames would receive their offering. The door would close. The entire process took less than 5 minutes. Giborg would then offer the chalice to the client, who would drink the mixture while he completed the inverted mass. The ceremony would conclude with prayers for the success of whatever dark wish had brought the woman there. The death of a husband, the love of a king, the destruction of a rival, the acquisition of wealth. Catherine would collect her payment, typically 1,000 livres or more per ceremony. The client would leave before dawn, returning to her normal life, carrying inside her the weight of infanticide disguised as magic. And Catherine would prepare for the next one. Because there was always a next one. The demand never stopped. The line of carriages arriving at midnight never shortened. The furnace never went cold. Marie Boss, who handled much of the poison distribution, would later testify that they conducted these ceremonies dozens of times per month during peak periods. The babies came from everywhere, illegitimate births, abandoned infants, children purchased from mothers who believed they were being saved from starvation. Catherine didn't discriminate. Every infant was simply raw material, inventory for her unholy business. But not all of Catherine's murders were ritualistic. Most were far more mundane, which somehow made them even more chilling. A typical transaction might proceed like this. A woman would arrive seeking a fortune reading. Catherine would sense desperation, probe gently with questions disguised as mystical insights. The woman would eventually confess her real problem. A husband who beat her, a lover who wouldn't commit, an inheritance being delayed by an inconvenient relative. Catherine would nod sympathetically. She would explain that some problems couldn't be solved by conventional means. She would mention carefully that she knew of solutions. She would watch the woman's face for any sign of shock or rejection. If she saw interest instead, she would continue. The poison would be presented as something almost medicinal. A powder for inducing sleep, she might call it, or a remedy for calming aggression. She would provide explicit instructions, how much to use, how to disguise the taste, how frequently to administer it. She would warn about the symptoms. The victim would become ill first, then weaker, then bedridden, then dead. She would charge anywhere from 100 to 1,000 livres, depending on the client's wealth and desperation. She would provide enough poison to kill several people, in case the first attempt failed or the client wanted to eliminate multiple obstacles. And then she would forget about it, because Catherine didn't need to witness the deaths to profit from them. She simply provided the means. What happened afterward was someone else's problem, someone else's crime. If the authorities came investigating, which they rarely did, Catherine could claim ignorance. She sold herbs and potions for legitimate purposes. If someone misused her products, how could she be held responsible? This plausible deniability was part of her genius. Her network of associates operated on the same principle. Marie Boss sold poisons while pretending to sell cosmetics. La Trianon provided medicinal powders that just happened to be lethal. La Lepere specialized in abortion-inducing drugs that sometimes killed the mother along with the fetus. An acceptable risk, she would explain, in desperate circumstances. They all shared information, techniques, suppliers. They referred clients to each other. They created a system so diffuse that no single person could be held accountable for all of it. But Catherine remained at the center, coordinating everything, collecting her percentage, building her fortune on a foundation of corpses. By the late 1660s, she had become wealthy enough to be conspicuous. She dressed in silks and velvets. She wore jewelry that would have been appropriate for minor nobility. She hosted dinner parties attended by artists, poets, and intellectuals who found her mysterious and compelling. She became impossibly fashionable. Women wanted to be like her, independent, powerful, unbound by the usual constraints of gender and class. They didn't know, or chose not to know, that her power came from murder. They saw only the results. A woman who answered to no man, who lived according to her own rules, who seemed to possess genuine magic. And Catherine encouraged this perception. She cultivated an air of mysticism and danger. She dropped hints about her connections to the supernatural. She allowed rumors to spread about her abilities, that she could curse enemies, that she could see the future, that she had made pacts with forces beyond human understanding. The truth was both more and less impressive. She had no magical powers. She simply understood human weakness and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. Her only supernatural gift was an absolute absence of conscience. The letter arrived at Catherine's door in the spring of 1667, carried by a servant whose livery suggested employment in a very distinguished household. The paper was expensive, the seal was real wax pressed with an aristocratic emblem, and the handwriting was educated and elegant. Someone important wanted Catherine's services. The client turned out to be one of the most dangerous women in France, Françoise Athénise de Roquecourt de Mortemart, the Marquise de Montespan, who had recently become the mistress of King Louis XIV himself. And Athénise had a problem that required Catherine's particular expertise. The problem was named Louise de la Vallière. Louise was the king's current favorite, the mother of several of his illegitimate children, and the primary obstacle to Athénise's ambition of becoming the undisputed royal mistress. Louise was younger, more innocent, genuinely in love with the king. Athénise was older, more calculating, determined to possess power rather than merely affection. She needed Louise removed, not killed necessarily, that would be too obvious, too dangerous, but diminished somehow, made less appealing, pushed aside so that Athénise could step forward into the light. Catherine listened to this request with the calm attention of a businesswoman evaluating a contract. This was an opportunity unlike any she'd encountered before. A client from Versailles itself, connected to the king, capable of paying extraordinary sums and providing protection from prosecution. It was also extraordinarily dangerous. One misstep, one whisper of scandal reaching the wrong ears, and Catherine wouldn't just lose her business. She'd lose her head. She accepted. The solution Catherine proposed was elegant in its combination of psychology and poison. She would provide Athenais with a series of potions, some designed to enhance her own attractiveness and sexual appeal, others designed to make Louise less appealing. Love potions for one, essentially, and subtle poisons for the other. The love potions were mostly theater, mixtures of wine, herbs, and substances like Spanish fly that might genuinely increase arousal. Catherine would perform elaborate rituals over these mixtures, claiming to charge them with supernatural power. Athenais would wear them as perfumes, add drops to the king's wine, bathe in water infused with the compounds. Whether they worked magically or simply boosted Athenais' confidence enough to make her more seductive didn't matter. The client believed they worked, which meant she kept paying. The poisons intended for Louise were more subtle. Catherine provided powders that could be introduced into food or drink, substances that would cause Louise to become ill frequently, headaches, stomach problems, fatigue. Nothing obviously life-threatening, but enough to make her seem weak, sickly, less vital. A woman who spent half her time in bed with mysterious ailments would naturally become less appealing to a king who valued beauty and vibrancy. The operation required careful coordination. Athenais couldn't administer these substances herself. Too risky, too obvious. So Catherine's network came into play. Servants were bribed. Ladies-in-waiting were recruited. Food could be tampered with in the kitchens before it reached Louise's table. Wine could be treated before being poured. Cosmetics could be laced with lead and mercury, applied by well-meaning maids who had no idea they were slowly poisoning their mistress. And it worked. Over the course of several months, Louise's health deteriorated. She became withdrawn, weakened, less present at court functions. The king's visits to her chambers decreased in frequency. Meanwhile, Athenais glowed with health and confidence, always present, always vibrant, always available. By 1667, Athenais had replaced Louise as the king's primary mistress. She would hold that position for over a decade, bearing 7 children by Louis XIV, wielding enormous influence over court politics and royal decisions. And Catherine Monvoisin had helped make it happen. The success of the Montespan operation opened floodgates. Other court women wanted the same services. If Catherine could help Athenais seduce a king, imagine what she could do for lesser ambitions. Attracting a wealthy husband, eliminating a romantic rival, ensuring an inheritance came through on schedule. The nobles came in increasing numbers, their carriages clogging Rue Beauregard, their money filling Catherine's coffers. She became wealthy beyond anything she'd imagined in her youth. She bought property. She invested in businesses. She began living like the aristocrats she served. But the Versailles connection created complications. Athenais was paranoid about maintaining her position. She demanded increasingly extreme services. When she feared the king's attention might be wandering, she wanted stronger love potions. When she suspected competitors of plotting against her, she wanted them cursed or poisoned. When her own children needed advantages, positions at court, favorable marriages, titles, she expected Catherine to provide magical assistance. Catherine obliged, because refusing Athenais meant making an enemy of someone who had the king's ear. But each service, each ceremony, each poison provided to court circles increased Catherine's risk. She was building something that couldn't be contained much longer. The black masses continued, now sometimes attended by noblewomen whose names would have shocked Paris if revealed. The Duchesse de Vivonne, Athenais' sister-in-law, participated in ceremonies. The Comtesse de Soissons, niece of Cardinal Mazarin, sought Catherine's services. Even the Princesse de Tingry, related to the king himself, consulted with La Voisin about removing obstacles to her ambitions. These weren't desperate women from the streets. These were educated, wealthy, powerful people who should have known better. But power makes people believe they're untouchable. They convinced themselves that their money and status would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. The scale of operations had grown enormous. Catherine now employed dozens of people. Assistants who mixed poisons, priests who performed ceremonies, thugs who disposed of bodies that couldn't be burned, informants who identified potential clients. Her house had become a factory of death, operating with industrial efficiency, and the body count kept rising. The infant murders continued unabated. Marie Boss would later estimate they were killing more than 100 babies per month during peak periods. The tiny bodies went into the furnace so regularly that Catherine had to have it cleaned and repaired frequently to maintain its efficiency. The smell of burning flesh became so common in her neighborhood that people simply assumed she was roasting meat in unusual quantities. The poison distribution reached epidemic levels. Marie Boss bragged drunkenly in a tavern that she'd made enough widows to fill a cemetery. La Trianon kept ledgers of her sales, carefully coded but still revealing hundreds of transactions. The network was spreading poison through Paris like a plague, causing deaths that were attributed to natural causes but were actually carefully planned murders. And Catherine was becoming careless. Success had made her bold. She no longer took the same precautions she'd maintained for years. She spoke more openly about her services. She allowed too many people into her confidence. She believed her connections to Versailles made her immune to prosecution. She was about to discover how wrong she was. The unraveling began not with Catherine, but with one of her associates. Marie Boss, drunk in a tavern, spoke too loudly about her work to the wrong person. She bragged about how many people she'd helped murder, how much money she'd made, how easy it was to kill someone without getting caught. Someone listening in that tavern was horrified enough to report what they'd heard to the police. In March 1679, Marie Boss was arrested. Under interrogation, facing torture and execution, she began talking about her network. She named names, described operations, and pointed investigators toward the woman at the center of everything, Catherine Monvoisin. The arrest came before dawn on March 12, 1679. Catherine was sleeping when they broke down her door. Not the gentle sleep of innocence, but the heavy sleep of someone who believed herself beyond reach. She woke to shouting, to the crash of furniture being overturned, to rough hands dragging her from bed. The officers of the police, led by Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, Paris's lieutenant general of police, had been planning this raid for weeks. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they found it. In Catherine's home, the investigators discovered an archive of horror. There were poisons in labeled bottles: arsenic, aconite, antimony, compounds whose very names suggested death. There were ledgers detailing transactions, carefully coded but decipherable, showing years of sales and services. There were letters from clients, some from identifiable noble houses. There were implements for the Black Mass: chalices, inverted crucifixes, black candles, vestments stained with what appeared to be blood. And in the garden, they found bones. When they excavated the area around Catherine's furnace, they discovered the remains of infants, fragments that hadn't burned completely, tiny skeletons compressed in the ash. The investigators, hardened men who'd seen death in many forms, were shaken by the sheer number of bones. They stopped counting after the first 100. Catherine was transported to the Château de Vincennes, to special cells that had been constructed for the investigation that would become known as the Affair of the Poisons. She was locked in a chamber designed to prevent suicide. No windows, no sharp objects, constant observation. They wanted her alive for interrogation. What followed was months of questioning, torture, and gradually extracted confessions. Catherine proved remarkably resilient at first. She denied everything, claimed the evidence had been planted, insisted she was just a simple fortune teller being persecuted for success. But as more of her network was arrested, Marie Boss, La Trianon, La Lepere, dozens of others, their testimonies created an irrefutable picture of her operations. Under torture, she began to break. The judicial torture of 17th century France was systematic and brutal. Catherine was subjected to the question ordinaire et extraordinaire, progressively severe applications of pain designed to extract truth. They used the brodikins, wooden boards that compressed the legs, crushing bones slowly. They used water torture, forcing enormous quantities down her throat until she felt she was drowning. They stretched her on the rack, pulling her joints until tendons began to separate. And eventually she talked. She confessed to the infant murders. She described the black masses in detail, how many she'd conducted, who had attended, what had been done with the bodies. She named her noble clients, though investigators noted she seemed careful about which names she revealed, protecting the most powerful while sacrificing those who couldn't help her. The confessions implicated over 440 people, including some of the most prominent figures in France. The investigation threatened to expose Versailles itself as a nest of poisoners and devil worshippers. King Louis XIV, realizing that his own mistress Athénise was deeply involved, made a decision that would shape how the case concluded. He ordered certain evidence suppressed. Files were sealed. Some testimony was declared inadmissible. The investigation was allowed to continue, but only against those who couldn't damage the crown. The most prominent nobles were protected, while the working-class poisoners and fortune-tellers were thrown to the executioner. Catherine realized she'd been abandoned by the very people she'd served. The women who'd paid her thousands of livres, who'd participated in her ceremonies, who'd commissioned murders through her network, none of them came to her aid. They retreated behind their titles and their connections, leaving her to face consequences alone. Her trial was swift and damning. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Physical evidence, multiple confessions from associates, her own admissions under torture. She was convicted of witchcraft, poisoning, sacrilege, and murder. The sentence was death by burning at the stake. Catherine spent her final days in her cell at Vincennes, watched constantly to prevent suicide. She was visited by priests who attempted to secure a final confession and repentance, but she remained defiant to the end. She refused to express remorse for the infant murders. She wouldn't acknowledge that the black masses were anything more than theater for gullible clients. She maintained that she'd simply provided services that people wanted, that she was being punished for succeeding in a society that was hypocritical about death. On February 22, 1680, she was transported to the Place de Grève, the execution ground of Paris. Thousands gathered to watch. Catherine had become infamous during her imprisonment. The newspapers had published lurid accounts of her crimes. The church had condemned her as a servant of Satan. The public had turned her into a monster more myth than woman. She was dressed in a white shift, the traditional garment of the condemned. Her hands were bound behind her back. She was paraded through the streets in a cart, allowing the crowds to jeer and throw refuse. If she felt fear, she didn't show it. Witnesses described her as composed, almost serene, as though she'd accepted this ending as inevitable. At the execution ground, she was led to the stake, a tall wooden post surrounded by bundles of wood and straw. She was chained to the post, the iron links secured so tightly she could barely move. The executioner offered her a chance to confess one final time, to repent and potentially earn the mercy of being strangled before the fire was lit. She refused. The torch was applied to the wood. The flames began to spread, first small and tentative, then growing rapidly, feeding on the dry straw. Smoke rose in thick columns. The crowd pressed forward, wanting to see every moment. Catherine Monvoisin burned. Eyewitnesses recorded that she screamed at first, when the flames reached her flesh. Then she began chanting something, words that might have been prayers or curses, though no one could hear clearly over the roar of the fire. Her body convulsed against the chains. Her skin blackened and split. The smell of burning flesh, so familiar to her from her furnace, from the hundreds of infants she'd destroyed, now came from her own cooking meat. It took approximately 30 minutes for her to die. By the end, her body was unrecognizable, a charred husk still chained to the stake. The crowds began to disperse, satisfied that justice had been served, unaware that many of the people who'd commissioned Catherine's crimes walked free among them. Her ashes were scattered, her property was confiscated, and her name became synonymous with evil. But the affair of the poisons continued for another 2 years, as investigators slowly worked through her network. Over 300 people were arrested, 36 were executed, many others were imprisoned or exiled. But the most prominent names, the nobles, the courtiers, the women close to the king, were protected. Athénise de Montespan never faced prosecution. She eventually fell from favor not because of her involvement with Catherine, but because the king's interest wandered to other women. She died in 1707, in a convent, her reputation damaged but her life intact. The affair of the poisons revealed something terrifying about the society that had created Catherine Monvoisin. She wasn't an aberration. She was a symptom. The same society that condemned her had created the demand for her services. The nobles who watched her burn had wanted the same services she provided. They'd simply been powerful enough to avoid consequences. Catherine understood this even at the end. In one of her final statements before execution, she said something that the authorities suppressed from official records, but that survived in private correspondence. "I am guilty of many deaths, but how many of those who paid me are guilty of desiring those deaths? I was their hands. They were the minds that commanded murder. Yet I burn alone." She was right. The French aristocracy continued to poison each other for decades after Catherine's death. The practice was so common that nobles began employing food tasters, that coded conversations developed around remedies and solutions, that sudden deaths among the wealthy were assumed to be murder until proven otherwise. Catherine Monvoisin hadn't created a culture of poisoning. She'd simply monetized it, systematized it, made it more efficient. She was executed not because her crimes were unique, but because she'd been careless enough to get caught and not important enough to protect. The furnace in her house on Rue Beauregard was destroyed after her execution. The building itself was torn down, the ground consecrated by priests who performed rituals meant to cleanse the evil that had occurred there. But locals claimed the spot remained cursed, that nothing would grow where her house had stood, that people could still smell burning flesh on certain nights when the wind blew wrong. For years afterward, mothers in St. Denis would frighten misbehaving children with threats. "La Voisin will come for you. She'll put you in her furnace." The name became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil could wear a pleasant face and offer its services with a smile. The records of the affair of the poisons were sealed by order of King Louis XIV. They remained locked away for over a century, hidden in the Bastille until the French Revolution. When revolutionaries stormed the prison in 1789, they discovered the files and began publishing them, shocking a new generation with revelations about the corruption of the old aristocracy. Those documents revealed the true scale of Catherine's operation. The conservative estimate of 2,500 infant murders came from testimony by her closest associates, but some investigators believed the number was higher, perhaps 3,000, perhaps more. The babies had been treated as raw materials, their deaths so routine that Catherine had stopped keeping detailed records of individual murders. The poison distribution network had been even more extensive than anyone realized during the trial. Investigators found evidence suggesting Catherine's compounds had been used in hundreds of murders across France, deaths that had been attributed to natural causes, accidents, or divine will. Husbands poisoned by wives, wives poisoned by husbands, children poisoned by parents eager for inheritance, rivals eliminated in business disputes, lovers removed by jealous competitors. Each death had a story, a person who'd paid Catherine for murder disguised as magic. Each victim had family who mourned them, never knowing that their loved one had been deliberately killed, that someone close to them had commissioned the death, that a woman in Paris had provided the means. The Black Masses remained the most disturbing element of Catherine's crimes. The ceremonies had perverted sacred ritual, had turned religious symbolism into tools for murder, had convinced educated women that killing babies would grant their wishes. The psychological manipulation required to make people believe this, to make them participate, revealed Catherine's true genius. She understood that people wanted to believe their evil had purpose, that murder could be sanctified if wrapped in enough ceremony. Etienne Guibourg, the defrocked priest who'd performed the ceremonies with Catherine, was arrested separately. Under torture, he provided testimony that confirmed and expanded on Catherine's confessions. He described the Black Masses in horrifying detail, the inverted prayers, the desecration of holy objects, the murders committed on the altar. He claimed to have performed over 1,000 such ceremonies during his association with Catherine. Guibourg was also executed, though by a different method. He was broken on the wheel, his limbs shattered with iron bars, then left to die slowly from shock and blood loss. His execution took several hours, and witnesses reported that he screamed prayers and blasphemies alternately until the end. The other members of Catherine's network met similar fates. Marie Boss was hanged, along with her 2 sons who'd assisted in the poison distribution. La Trianon was burned alive, like Catherine. La Le Perret was branded with hot irons and imprisoned for life. Dozens of others faced execution, torture, imprisonment, or exile. But the shadow of the affair of the poisons extended far beyond the executed criminals. The scandal damaged the reputation of the French aristocracy, revealed the court at Versailles as a nest of intrigue and murder, and created suspicion that lasted generations. Nobles began to fear their own servants, their own families, anyone who might have access to their food or drink. The church was also implicated, not just through Giborg, but through evidence that other priests had participated in Catherine's ceremonies or had provided her with sacred objects for desecration. The Catholic Church conducted its own internal investigation, defrocking priests, closing churches that had been compromised, attempting to distance itself from the scandal. Medical practice changed as well. Physicians became more aware of poisoning as a cause of death, more careful in their diagnoses, more willing to suspect murder when symptoms matched certain patterns. Toxicology began to develop as a science, driven partly by the need to detect the kinds of poisons Catherine had distributed so freely. And in the broader culture, Catherine Monvoisin became a legend, the ultimate villain, the woman who'd killed without conscience, who'd turned motherhood into murder and religion into sacrilege. Writers used her as a character in novels and plays. Philosophers referenced her when discussing human depravity. Historians studied her life, trying to understand how one woman could cause so much death. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Catherine's legacy is how ordinary she was. She wasn't a monster born of darkness. She was a poor woman who wanted more, who saw an opportunity and took it, who discovered that people would pay for terrible services if those services were packaged correctly. She had no special powers, no supernatural abilities, no demonic pacts. She simply understood human nature, the capacity for cruelty, the willingness to harm others for personal gain, the ability to rationalize evil. She was, in many ways, a perfect entrepreneur. She identified demand and supplied it. She scaled her operation efficiently. She built a network of suppliers and distributors. She cultivated important clients and maintained their loyalty. She adapted to market conditions and expanded her services to meet new needs. The fact that her business was murder doesn't change the fundamental mechanics of what she built. It simply reveals what capitalism looks like without conscience, what happens when profit becomes the only value, when other human beings become mere resources to be exploited. Catherine Monvoisin died on February 22, 1680, her body consumed by flames in front of thousands of witnesses. But her crimes continued to echo through history, a reminder of how easily civilization can harbor monsters, how readily people will embrace evil if it promises to fulfill their desires, how thin the line is between order and chaos. The babies she murdered never had names. They were never baptized, never recorded, never mourned. They existed only as numbers in testimonies, as bones in ash, as fuel for ceremonies that promised power but delivered only death. They were the ultimate victims, helpless, innocent, destroyed before they could even understand they were alive. And their killer died believing she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd simply provided services in a world that demanded them. To the very end, Catherine Monvoisin saw herself not as a murderer but as a businesswoman, not as evil but as pragmatic, not as a monster but as someone who'd had the courage to do what others only dreamed about. History remembers her differently. She remains one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, a woman whose body count exceeds that of almost any other individual killer. She pioneered organized murder for hire, created systems that would be replicated by criminal organizations for centuries. She proved that evil doesn't require supernatural powers or elaborate philosophy. It just requires opportunity, absence of conscience, and willing customers. The house on Rue Beauregard where she conducted her operations is gone now, replaced by modern buildings that bear no trace of what happened there. But in the archives, in the sealed documents that were eventually released, in the testimony of those who knew her, Catherine Monvoisin remains. A portrait of human evil at its most banal and its most horrifying. She was the midwife who brought death instead of life, the fortune teller who sold poison instead of hope, the businesswoman who built an empire on infant bones and arsenic, the woman who convinced herself that murder was just another service, death just another commodity, and conscience just an inconvenience to be discarded in pursuit of profit. And when the flames finally consumed her, when her screams finally stopped and her body became ash scattered in the wind, Paris breathed easier. Not because the evil was gone, but because one expression of that evil had finally been punished. But the customers who'd commissioned her crimes, the nobles who'd paid for murder, the society that had created the demand for her services, they continued unchanged, protected by power and privilege, carrying their guilt in silence until death claimed them through natural means. Catherine Monvoisin burned alone, but she was never alone in her guilt. The ashes settled. The records were sealed. The scandal faded into history. But every so often, when researchers open those old documents, when they read the testimonies and examine the evidence, when they count the bones and calculate the deaths, they're confronted with an uncomfortable truth. Catherine Monvoisin existed because her society wanted her to exist. She provided what people desired. She fulfilled needs that respectable society wouldn't acknowledge but couldn't suppress. She was the monster in the mirror, the reflection of aristocratic ambition, desperate poverty, religious hypocrisy, and human cruelty. And when society finally looked at that reflection, it didn't like what it saw. So it destroyed the mirror and pretended the reflection was gone. But somewhere in Paris, in archives and sealed files, in historical records and old testimonies, Catherine Monvoisin still exists. A reminder that the greatest horrors don't come from darkness. They come from people who see clearly, who understand what others want, and who lack the conscience to say no when those wants turn toward death. The devil's midwife is dead, but her legacy reminds us that evil doesn't need horns and a tail. Sometimes it just needs a pleasant smile, a reputation for discretion, and customers willing to pay for the unthinkable. Sometimes evil is just good business, and that might be the most terrifying truth of all. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Poison Mistress. Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubry, Madame de Brinvilliers, aka the Angel of Death. Death wore silk and spoke in whispers, and for 7 years, it dined at the finest tables in Paris. Your coffee grows cold while you read the morning paper. Steam rises from the cup, curling like phantom fingers. You take a sip, bitter, slightly metallic. Strange. You drink again anyway. By evening, your stomach twists into knots. By midnight, you're vomiting blood. By dawn, you're writing your will. But here's what chills the blood. The woman who brought you that coffee, she's weeping at your bedside, pressing a cool cloth to your burning forehead, whispering prayers for your recovery. She watches you die with tears streaming down her porcelain face. Tears of satisfaction, not sorrow, because she's the one who put the arsenic in your cup. And she's been practicing on hospital patients for months to get the dosage just right. This is not fiction. This is not mythology. This is the true story of Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubry, Madame de Brinvilliers, a French noblewoman who turned murder into an art form, family into prey, and poison into her weapon of choice. Between 1666 and 1672, she methodically exterminated her own blood relatives, tested her toxins on the sick and dying, and smiled through every funeral she orchestrated. Her lover was her accomplice, her inheritance was her motive, and her elegance was her perfect disguise. Welcome to the story of France's most beautiful monster. Paris, 1630. The city of light concealed rivers of darkness. And into this world of contrasts emerged Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubry, born into privilege, cradled by wealth, educated beyond most women of her era. She should have been nothing more than another aristocratic wife, another footnote in the ledgers of French nobility. But destiny had written something far more sinister across the pages of her life. Her father, Antoine Drew d'Aubry, served as the civil lieutenant of Paris, a position of tremendous authority and respect. The family name carried weight. Their estate breathed old money. Young Marie-Madeleine wanted for nothing, except perhaps boundaries. Her childhood passed in a blur of indulgence, her adolescence shaped by desires met before they fully formed. She learned early that beauty opened doors, that charm disarmed suspicion, and that consequences belonged to other people. At 21, she married Antoine Gobelin de Brinvilliers, a nobleman whose fortune matched her family's prestige. The union should have solidified her position, guaranteed her comfort, ensured her contentment. Instead, it became the cage that bred her monstrosity. Her husband proved weak, unfaithful, spineless, a man who carried a title like an actor wears a costume. Marie-Madeleine soon mirrored his infidelities, but where he stumbled through affairs with clumsy indiscretion, she hunted with calculated precision. Then came Gaudin de Saint Croix, cavalry officer, amateur chemist, professional seducer. Their meeting ignited something unholy. He possessed knowledge of toxicology acquired during military service, an understanding of compounds and their effects that fascinated her twisted curiosity. She brought passion, ambition, and access to wealth. Together, they formed a partnership that would redefine domestic terrorism. The affair blazed openly, scandalously. Her father watched his family name dragged through Parisian gossip circles. The humiliation burned him. In 1663, Antoine Drew d'Aubry exercised his authority and had Saint Croix arrested under a lettre de cachet, essentially a warrant signed by the king himself. Saint Croix found himself thrown into the Bastille, separated from his lover, stripped of his freedom. This should have ended the story. It should have been a cautionary tale about forbidden passion meeting patriarchal authority. Instead, it became the origin story of a serial killer. During his imprisonment, Saint Croix shared a cell with an Italian chemist named Exili. This man possessed knowledge that would prove catastrophic, expertise in creating poisons so subtle they mimicked natural illness, so refined they left no trace, so reliable they killed with mathematical precision. Hour after hour, day after day, Exili shared his deadly recipes. Saint Croix absorbed every word like a student before a master. He learned about arsenic and antimony, about belladonna and mercury compounds. He discovered how to disguise bitter tastes, how to calibrate dosages, how to make murder look like misfortune. When Saint Croix emerged from the Bastille months later, he carried something more dangerous than anger. He carried knowledge, and he brought it straight to Marie-Madeleine. Picture their reunion, not just as lovers, but as conspirators. They didn't simply fall back into each other's arms. They fell into plotting. Her father's interference had consequences, they agreed. Consequences that would be permanent. But first, they needed to practice. They needed to refine their craft. They needed test subjects. Marie-Madeleine began volunteering at the Hôtel Dieu, Paris's oldest hospital. To the outside world, this appeared as noble charity. A wealthy woman bringing comfort to the suffering. The hospital administrators welcomed her warmly. The priests praised her piety. The patients, desperate for any kindness, accepted her offerings gratefully. What none of them knew was that she arrived with pockets full of poison. She moved through the wards like an angel of death dressed in silk. She brought pastries laced with arsenic to bedridden patients. She offered water contaminated with antimony to dying men who had no family to question their declining health. She studied their symptoms with clinical detachment, noting how quickly the poison worked, observing which dosages proved fatal, documenting which compounds caused the most suffering before death arrived. The patients who accepted her kindness developed sudden agonies. Their stomachs cramped violently. They vomited until blood stained their lips. Their skin took on a grayish pallor. Some died within hours. Others lingered for days, their bodies fighting against the toxins coursing through their systems. Marie Madeleine watched it all, making mental notes, adjusting her formulas, perfecting her method. How many died during these experiments? Historical records suggest dozens, though the exact number remains lost to time. The hospital recorded their deaths as natural complications from existing illnesses. No one suspected the charitable noblewoman who wept so convincingly at their bedsides. No one thought to question why so many patients declined so rapidly after receiving her special attention. Back in St. Croix's laboratory, a secret space where they mixed their deadly cocktails, they refined their recipes. They developed a signature poison, a blend of arsenic and other compounds that produced symptoms indistinguishable from natural disease. The mixture caused progressive illness. Stomach pains, then vomiting, then fever, then organ failure. Death arrived slowly enough to avoid suspicion, but certainly enough to guarantee results. By 1666, they felt ready. Their poisons worked flawlessly. Their method left no evidence. Their confidence bordered on arrogance. Now they simply needed to select their first real target. Someone whose death would benefit them directly. Someone whose fortune would flow into Marie Madeleine's waiting hands. Her father had destroyed her relationship, had humiliated her lover, had demonstrated that parental authority trumped her desires. Antoine Drew d'Aubry would pay for that interference. He would pay with his life, and his death would be the first step toward financial independence, toward freedom from oversight, toward a future where Marie Madeleine answered to no one. The planning began in earnest. They couldn't simply poison him outright, too suspicious, too obvious. Instead, they would employ a technique that would become their trademark: slow poisoning. Small doses administered over months, creating progressive illness that doctors would attribute to natural decline. They would make his death look like the unfortunate but inevitable result of age and failing health. What they needed now was access. Regular, consistent, unquestioned access to Antoine Drew d'Aubry's food and drink. They needed someone inside his household, someone loyal to Marie Madeleine, someone willing to become an accomplice to patricide. They found their instrument in Jean Hamelin, usually called La Chaussée, a servant in financial debt to Marie Madeleine. She owned him through his desperation. She controlled him through his weakness, and she would use him to murder her father. The pieces were in place. The poison was ready. The plan was formed. All that remained was execution. In every sense of the word, the murder of Antoine Drew d'Aubry began not with a single lethal dose, but with patience. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was calculated, methodical extermination disguised as filial devotion. Marie Madeleine understood that sudden death invited investigation. Gradual decline, however, inspired only sympathy. La Chaussée entered the d'Aubry household in 1666 under the pretense of seeking employment. The civil lieutenant's staff welcomed him without suspicion. He presented well, worked diligently, and demonstrated loyalty that seemed genuine. Within weeks, he had integrated himself into the household routines. Within months, he had access to everything that mattered, including Antoine's meals. The poisoning began subtly, a small amount of arsenic mixed into morning wine, a dusting of antimony compound stirred into evening soup. Dosages carefully calibrated to cause discomfort without immediate danger. Marie Madeleine had learned from her hospital experiments that slow accumulation proved more effective than sudden assault. The body could fight a single massive dose, could expel toxins, could sometimes survive. But repeated small poisonings? They wore down resistance. They accumulated in organs. They created progressive damage that mimicked natural disease. Antoine began feeling unwell in early summer. Stomach pains troubled him. His appetite diminished. He attributed it to stress. His position demanded constant attention, involved navigating complex political waters, required maintaining order in a chaotic city. His physicians prescribed rest and dietary adjustments. They detected nothing suspicious. They saw only an aging man whose body was beginning to fail. Marie Madeleine visited her father regularly during his illness, playing the concerned daughter with consummate skill. She sat beside his bed, held his hand, expressed worry that seemed entirely genuine. She brought him broths and tonics, some prepared in her own kitchen, all containing trace amounts of poison. She watched him sip the very liquid killing him, and she smiled with tender affection. The summer months passed with Antoine's health slowly deteriorating. Good days alternated with terrible ones. He would rally briefly, his strength returning, his optimism renewed. Then he would collapse again, the symptoms returning with renewed vigor. His doctors remained baffled. They tried various treatments, bloodletting, purgatives, herbal remedies. Nothing helped. Nothing could help, because the cause of his illness kept arriving with each meal, with each drink, with each loving offering from his devoted daughter. By autumn, Antoine could barely leave his bed. His skin had taken on a sallow appearance. His eyes had sunken into his skull. His body, once robust and commanding, had withered to skeletal fragility. He experienced constant nausea. His bowels betrayed him regularly. The pain in his abdomen never fully subsided. Still, his physicians diagnosed nothing more sinister than natural decline accelerated by unknown illness. Marie Madeleine intensified her visits as his condition worsened. She needed to be present, needed to be seen as the loving daughter, needed to establish her grief before it became necessary. She wept at his bedside. She prayed loudly for his recovery. She consulted with doctors, demanding they do more, try harder, save her beloved father. Her performance was flawless. On September 10th, 1666, Antoine Drew d'Aubry died in agony. His final hours involved violent convulsions. He vomited repeatedly, bringing up material stained with blood. His fever spiked to dangerous levels. His breathing became labored, then ragged, then ceased. The death certificate listed natural causes. Organ failure due to prolonged illness of undetermined origin. No one suspected poison. No one investigated further. No one questioned the grieving daughter who collapsed dramatically at the funeral. With her father's death, Marie Madeleine expected to inherit a substantial portion of his estate. But French inheritance law favored sons over daughters. Her two brothers, Antoine d'Aubry and François d'Aubry, stood between her and the fortune she craved. What she received seemed insultingly small compared to what she felt entitled to claim. The resentment festered immediately. The solution formed just as quickly. If one patricide could succeed undetected, why not two more? Why not eliminate every obstacle between herself and financial independence? Her brothers possessed wealth she needed, status she envied, and, most critically, no suspicion whatsoever about their father's death. They were lambs unaware of the wolf among them. Marie Madeleine and Saint Croix began planning the next murders before the mourning period ended. They had refined their method. They understood the timelines required. They knew exactly how much poison over how many months would produce fatal results while maintaining the appearance of natural illness. All they needed was access to her brother's households. La Chaussee had proven himself with Antoine's murder. His loyalty appeared unshakable, his discretion absolute, his willingness to kill uncomplicated by moral hesitation. Marie Madeleine decided to employ him again, but this time the challenge was greater. Her brothers didn't live under one roof. They maintained separate households. Poisoning them simultaneously would require careful coordination. She began with Antoine d'Aubry, her eldest brother. The plan followed the same pattern that had worked so effectively before. Infiltrate the household, gain access to food and drink, administer poison in small but cumulative doses, create progressive illness that doctors would attribute to natural causes. La Chaussee approached Antoine d'Aubry with a fabricated story about seeking new employment. Antoine, unaware of the servant's role in his father's death, interviewed him and found him acceptable. By early 1667, La Chaussee had joined Antoine's household staff. The poisoning began within days. Antoine d'Aubry's decline mirrored his father's almost exactly. It started with digestive troubles, cramping, nausea, loss of appetite. His physicians recommended bland foods and rest. The symptoms would improve briefly, then return worse than before. Weeks turned into months with his health following a predictable downward trajectory. Marie-Madeleine visited her brother regularly, bringing him the same deadly kindness she had shown their father. She prepared special meals. She offered tonics. She sat with him during his worst moments. She documented his suffering with the same clinical detachment she had applied to her hospital victims. She was refining her art, perfecting her technique, becoming more efficient with each murder. The poison accumulated in Antoine's organs. His liver began to fail. His kidneys struggled. His digestive system essentially stopped functioning. He lost dramatic amounts of weight. His complexion turned yellowish gray. The pain became constant and unbearable. Still, no one suspected poison. The doctors diagnosed it as a mysterious wasting disease, possibly hereditary given that his father had suffered similar symptoms. On June 17, 1670, Antoine d'Aubry died in circumstances nearly identical to his father's death. He convulsed violently. He vomited blood. His fever reached dangerous peaks. His body shut down system by system until nothing remained but a corpse that barely resembled the healthy man he had been months earlier. Once again, the death certificate listed natural causes. Once again, no investigation followed. Once again, Marie-Madeleine performed her grief to perfection. One brother remained, François d'Aubry. He had watched his father die mysteriously. He had watched his brother suffer identical symptoms. But even this pattern failed to trigger suspicion. Death was common in 17th century France. Disease was poorly understood. The idea that a noblewoman might systematically murder her male relatives for inheritance money existed outside the realm of contemporary imagination. François represented the final obstacle to Marie-Madeleine's financial goals. With him dead, the family fortune would consolidate significantly in her favor. The inheritance laws still disadvantaged her as a woman, but with all male heirs eliminated, she would claim substantially more than originally allotted. La Chaussee had successfully infiltrated 2 households and executed 2 murders without detection. Marie-Madeleine decided to use him again for the final familial killing. The method would remain consistent, slow poisoning over many months, creating illness that mimicked natural disease. By mid-1670, La Chaussee had positioned himself in François d'Aubry's household. The pattern repeated with horrifying precision. Small doses of poison introduced regularly into food and drink. Progressive symptoms developing over weeks and months. Doctors baffled by an illness they couldn't identify or treat. Marie-Madeleine playing the concerned sister, visiting frequently, bringing fatal kindness disguised as family devotion. François' death throes began in autumn 1670. He experienced the same digestive agonies as his father and brother before him. His body wasted away. His organs began failing. The pain rendered him bedridden. And throughout it all, his sister held his hand, wiped his fevered brow, and whispered reassurances while the poison she had orchestrated worked its way through his system. On September 27, 1670, François d'Aubry died. The circumstances matched his father's and brother's deaths so precisely that it should have triggered investigation. 3 men from the same family, dying within 4 years, all experiencing identical symptoms, yet still no one suspected murder. The doctors attributed it to hereditary weakness, to some genetic flaw that made the d'Aubry men susceptible to mysterious wasting diseases. Marie-Madeleine had now successfully murdered her father and both brothers. She had eliminated the 3 men who stood between her and substantial wealth. She had watched them die slowly, painfully, while maintaining the perfect facade of grieving family member. And she had gotten away with it completely. No investigation, no charges, no consequences, just funerals, inheritance documents, and increased financial freedom. But success bred arrogance. With 3 undetected murders behind her, Marie-Madeleine began to believe herself untouchable. She had committed the perfect crimes, had manipulated everyone around her, had proven that intelligence and careful planning could defeat any obstacle. This confidence would prove catastrophic, because while she had been busy murdering her family, her accomplice, Gaudin de Sainte Croix, had been making fatal mistakes. July 30th, 1672. The Paris heat hung oppressive and thick, the kind of weather that made thinking difficult and breathing laborious. In his private laboratory, Gaudin de St. Croix worked with his poisons, mixing compounds, testing formulations, continuing the deadly research that had already claimed multiple lives. He wore a glass mask of his own design, a primitive respirator meant to protect him from toxic fumes. The device covered his nose and mouth, allowing him to breathe while working with volatile substances. Then catastrophe struck. The glass mask slipped from his face, or perhaps it cracked. Or maybe he simply removed it too early. The historical record remains unclear on the exact mechanism. What followed, however, was documented with grim precision. St. Croix inhaled deeply and drew poison directly into his lungs. The effect was immediate and devastating. He collapsed within seconds, his body convulsing violently. The toxins he had spent years perfecting now coursed through his own system. His lungs burned, his throat closed, his heart raced erratically. Within minutes, Gaudin de St. Croix, master poisoner, Marie Madeleine's lover and accomplice, the man who had taught her how to murder, died alone in his laboratory, killed by his own creation. When authorities entered the locked laboratory to investigate his sudden death, they discovered something far more damning than simply a fatal accident. The room contained an archive of murder, shelves lined with bottles of poison, notebooks filled with chemical formulas, recipes for compounds designed specifically to kill slowly and avoid detection. And most critically, a red chest locked with multiple mechanisms, hidden in a corner, clearly containing something St. Croix had considered extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. The investigating magistrate ordered the chest opened. Inside, they found documents that would expose the most shocking serial murder case Paris had seen in generations. Letters between St. Croix and Marie Madeleine discussing their crimes in explicit detail. Records of poison purchases and formulations. Accounting notes showing payments to La Chaussee for his role in the murders. And most damning of all, a confession written by St. Croix himself, detailing exactly how they had killed Antoine Drew d'Aubry and his sons, describing the methods used, acknowledging his role as chemical supplier and accomplice. The authorities moved quickly. La Chaussee was arrested first, seized before he could flee or destroy evidence. Under initial questioning, he denied everything. But when confronted with the documentary evidence from St. Croix's chest, his resistance crumbled. He admitted to administering poison to the d'Aubry men. He described how Marie Madeleine had recruited him, how St. Croix had supplied the toxins, how they had planned each murder carefully to avoid detection. On March 24, 1673, La Chaussee faced execution. The method chosen reflected the severity and premeditation of his crimes. He would be broken on the wheel, a torture device that involved methodically shattering every major bone in the body while the condemned remained conscious and aware. Then his broken body would be displayed publicly as a warning to others. The execution proceeded as scheduled. La Chaussee was tied to a large wagon wheel. Executioners wielded heavy iron bars. They began with his limbs, crushing the bones in his legs and arms with measured strikes. Each blow produced a sickening crack audible to the assembled crowd. La Chaussee screamed until his voice gave out. The executioners continued, breaking his ribs, his pelvis, his shoulders. Only after every major bone had been shattered did they deliver the final blow to his chest, crushing his heart and ending his agony. His body remained on display for days, rotting in public view, a gruesome reminder that even servant accomplices would face full punishment. But La Chaussee was merely a tool. The real architect of the murders remained free. Marie Madeleine had learned of St. Croix's death and the discovery of his incriminating documents. She understood immediately that her world was collapsing. Arrest was imminent. Trial was certain. Execution was likely. She did the only thing that offered any chance of survival. She ran. Marie Madeleine fled Paris under cover of darkness, taking whatever portable wealth she could carry. She headed for the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, which at the time maintained complicated extradition relationships with France. If she could reach a convent there, claim religious sanctuary, she might escape French justice indefinitely. She successfully crossed the border and found refuge at the convent of Liège. The nuns accepted her story without excessive questioning. A noblewoman fleeing personal scandal or family conflict was not unusual. They offered her sanctuary, a small cell, and the protection of religious authority. Marie Madeleine must have believed she had escaped. That distance and ecclesiastical protection would shield her from consequences. That the murders would remain unpunished because she remained unreachable. She was wrong. French authorities were not willing to let a serial killer avoid justice simply because she had fled across a border. They issued formal warrants. They contacted their diplomatic counterparts in the Spanish Netherlands. They applied pressure through every available channel. And they dispatched someone specifically to bring her back. François Disgrès, a police officer with a reputation for tracking fugitives and a determination that bordered on obsessive. Disgrès spent months gathering intelligence. He learned Marie Madeleine's location. He studied the convent's security. He developed a plan that would require patience, deception, and careful timing. He couldn't simply storm a convent and seize her. That would create international incidents and might give her time to flee again. He needed to lure her out voluntarily. Disgrès disguised himself as an abbé, a priest. He presented himself at the convent, claiming to be traveling through the region. He attended services. He conversed pleasantly with the nuns. And he waited for an opportunity to encounter Marie Madeleine privately. His chance came after several days when she walked in the convent gardens, believing herself safe within the religious walls. Disgrès approached her with apparent innocence. He engaged her in conversation. He expressed sympathy for her troubles. He suggested they might discuss her situation more privately. Marie Madeleine, believing him to be a fellow fugitive from French authority or perhaps simply a sympathetic ear, agreed to meet him outside the convent walls for a confidential conversation. The moment she stepped beyond the protection of consecrated ground, Disgrès revealed his true identity. He seized her immediately. Before she could scream or flee, he had her restrained. Before the nuns could intervene, he had her in a carriage racing toward the French border. Marie Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubry, Madame de Brinvilliers, mass murderer and poisoner, was finally in custody. The journey back to Paris took days. Marie Madeleine spent it in chains, the comfortable life she had murdered to maintain now irretrievably lost. She understood what awaited her: trial, torture, execution. The French justice system showed no mercy to serial killers, particularly those who had murdered family members for inheritance. When she arrived in Paris, the city erupted with scandal. The aristocracy was horrified that one of their own could commit such crimes. The common people were simultaneously fascinated and repulsed. Broadsheets and pamphlets spread details of her crimes throughout the city. Her beauty, which had once opened doors and disarmed suspicion, now became another element of the horrifying story. How could someone so elegant, so refined, so lovely have been capable of such monstrous acts? Marie Madeleine was imprisoned to await trial. But before formal proceedings could begin, the authorities needed her confession. Under French law of the period, confession was considered essential, and they had methods to extract it. Methods that would break the strongest will. Methods specifically designed to overcome resistance and produce detailed admissions of guilt. They would use judicial torture, and Marie Madeleine, despite all her intelligence and planning, despite her years of successful deception, would be unable to withstand it. The interrogation of Marie Madeleine de Brinvilliers began in a stone chamber deep within the conciergerie prison. The room held instruments designed for a single purpose: extracting truth through systematic infliction of pain. Iron boots for crushing feet, racks for dislocating joints, the water torture apparatus. And presiding over it all, magistrates who needed her confession not just for conviction. The evidence was already overwhelming, but for completeness, for understanding the full scope of her crimes, for ensuring no accomplices remained unidentified. They started with questions. Gentle at first, almost conversational. Would she admit to murdering her father, her brothers, the hospital patients? Marie Madeleine refused, maintaining her innocence despite the documentary evidence. She claimed St. Croix had acted alone. She insisted she knew nothing of poison. She performed outrage at being accused of such heinous acts. The magistrates exchanged glances. They had expected this resistance. They were prepared for it. They ordered the torture to begin. The water torture came first. Executioners forced Marie Madeleine onto a wooden rack, tilting it backward so her head hung lower than her feet. They wrapped her face in cloth, then poured water slowly over the fabric. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Drowning without submersion, suffocation without being underwater. The cloth prevented breathing. The water filled her nose and mouth. Her body's panic response screamed for air that wouldn't come. They paused, asked questions, gave her moments to gasp and choke, then repeated the process. Pour, suffocate, panic, questions during brief respites, refusal from Marie Madeleine. More water, more drowning, more terror. But she was stronger than they expected. Hours of water torture produced screams but no confession. Her will, forged through years of cold-blooded murder, proved remarkably resistant to breaking. The magistrates escalated. They applied the Brodequins' iron boots designed to crush bones. Executioners placed her legs into metal frames, then drove wooden wedges between the metal and her flesh. Each strike of the hammer drove the wedges deeper, compressing her legs, crushing tissue, cracking bone. The pain was extraordinary. Marie Madeleine's screams echoed through the prison. Prisoners in other cells heard her agony and understood that someone was being questioned seriously. Between hammer strikes, they asked questions. Who else was involved? How many people had she killed? What other crimes had she committed? Marie Madeleine, through tears and screams, began to break. The physical anguish overwhelmed her resistance. The carefully constructed facade of innocence shattered like her bones under the iron. She confessed, first to her father's murder, then her brother's, then, in a flood of admissions, to the hospital killings. She estimated 30 patients dead by her hand, though she couldn't remember exact numbers. They were experiments, she explained, practice, necessary steps toward perfecting her method. She showed no remorse, only exhaustion and defeat. The magistrates pressed further. Had she poisoned anyone else? Her husband? Other relatives? Business partners? Marie Madeleine admitted to attempting to poison her husband on multiple occasions, though he had survived. She confessed to poisoning a sister-in-law, though that murder had also failed. She revealed that she had considered murdering her own children to prevent them from inheriting portions of the estate she coveted. The confession continued for hours, producing a document that would horrify France for generations. She detailed her methodology with clinical precision. Which poisons worked best, which symptoms appeared first, how long death typically took. She described watching her victims suffer with the same detachment she might use to discuss a recipe or a dress pattern. She admitted that she had felt nothing while murdering her family except satisfaction at her own cleverness. When the confession was complete, signed in her own hand despite her broken body, the magistrates scheduled her trial. It was largely a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession detailed, the crimes undeniable. But French law required formal proceedings, required opportunity for defense, required public accountability. The trial took place in April 1676. Marie Madeleine appeared before the court broken but defiant. Her legs, shattered during torture, could barely support her weight. Her beauty, once her greatest asset, had been eroded by imprisonment and suffering. Yet she maintained a strange dignity throughout the proceedings, as if she still believed her social status might somehow save her. The prosecution detailed her crimes methodically. 3 family members murdered for inheritance. 30 or more hospital patients poisoned as experiments. Multiple attempted murders of her husband and others. All committed over nearly a decade while maintaining the perfect disguise of a charitable, devoted noblewoman. The evidence was presented. St. Croix's documents, La Chaussee's testimony before his execution, Marie Madeleine's own confession. She offered no real defense. What defense could she offer? She had confessed. The evidence was irrefutable. Her lawyers could only argue for mercy based on her sex and social status, arguments that fell hollow given the monstrous nature of her crimes. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was predetermined by the severity of her crimes and the need for public justice. Marie Madeleine de Brinvilliers would die by methods designed to equal her offenses. On July 16, 1676, her execution began with the amende honorable, a public ritual of humiliation. She was led through Paris streets in a cart, dressed only in a thin white shift. Crowds gathered to witness the poisoner's final journey. Some threw garbage, some shouted curses, some simply watched in silence, simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by the elegant woman who had murdered so efficiently and without conscience. The cart stopped first at the entrance of Notre Dame Cathedral. There, Marie Madeleine was forced to kneel and publicly confess her crimes. She had to acknowledge before God and the assembled crowd that she had murdered her father, her brothers, and numerous innocent patients. She had to express remorse, though whether she felt any genuine regret remained questionable. Then came the physical torture preceding execution. She was taken to the Place de Grève, Paris's primary execution site. There, executioners applied the question ordinaire, intense torture designed to extract any final confessions or information about potential accomplices. They used the water torture again, more severely than during her interrogation. They broke additional bones. They stretched her body on the rack until joints dislocated. Marie Madeleine screamed and begged for death. She had no more information to give, no additional crimes to confess. The torture continued anyway, both as punishment and as public spectacle. The crowd watched with grim satisfaction. This was justice made visible, evil being punished, a monster being destroyed. Finally, when the torture had been deemed sufficient, they prepared for execution. The method chosen was decapitation followed by burning. She would be beheaded first, a mercy, relatively speaking, as it ensured quick death. Then her corpse would be burned to ashes and the ashes scattered, ensuring no grave marker could ever commemorate her existence. The executioner positioned Marie Madeleine at the block. She no longer had the strength to resist. Her body had been broken by torture. Her spirit had been crushed by the certainty of death. She laid her head on the wooden surface, her neck exposed to the blade. The executioner raised his sword. The crowd held its collective breath. Then the blade fell with terrible finality. Marie Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubry, Madame de Brinvilliers, serial killer and poisoner, died instantly, her head separated from her body, rolling away as blood pooled on the execution platform. But death was not the end of her punishment. Her body was thrown onto a massive pyre built specifically for this purpose. The flames consumed her corpse over several hours, reducing flesh and bone to ash. The executioners ensured nothing recognizable remained. No bones for relics, no remains for burial, nothing that could be preserved or memorialized. When the fire finally burned out, workers collected her ashes and scattered them across Paris, in the Seine River, in streets, in fields. She would have no grave, no marker, no place where sympathizers or the curious might gather. Her physical existence was literally erased from the earth. The execution of Marie Madeleine should have ended the story. Justice had been served. Evil had been punished. The aristocracy could pretend such monstrous behavior was an aberration rather than a symptom of deeper problems. But her crimes had exposed something troubling about poison as a weapon, about how easily it could be acquired and deployed, about how vulnerable people were to trusted family members who chose to kill. The affair of the poisons, a larger scandal involving numerous French aristocrats accused of using poison for murder, erupted partially as a result of Marie Madeleine's case. Her trial had revealed networks of poison suppliers, shadowy chemists willing to sell deadly compounds to anyone with money, and a disturbing number of nobles who viewed murder as an acceptable solution to inconvenient problems. King Louis XIV, horrified by the implications, ordered sweeping investigations that would ultimately implicate dozens of aristocrats, including members of his own court. The investigation uncovered a sprawling criminal underground. Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin, operated as Paris's most notorious poison supplier, selling arsenic and other toxins to aristocratic clients alongside fortune-telling and alleged sorcery. Her client list read like a who's who of French nobility: women seeking to murder unfaithful husbands, men eliminating rivals, heirs accelerating inheritances. Marie Madeleine had been merely the most successful and most prolific of numerous poisoners working throughout upper-class Paris. Special courts called the Chamber Ardente, the Burning Chamber, were established specifically to prosecute these cases. Over the next 4 years, hundreds of people were arrested. Dozens were executed. The trials revealed a society where poison had become an accepted tool of ambition, where murder for convenience had infected the highest levels of French aristocracy, where human life held value only insofar as it served personal interests. La Voisin herself was burned alive in 1680 after being convicted of witchcraft and murder. Her execution drew massive crowds, even larger than Marie Madeleine's had, because her crimes implicated so many powerful people. She died screaming curses at the nobles who had purchased her poisons, claiming that if she went down, she would take them with her. The authorities cut her tongue out before burning her to prevent her from naming names publicly. The scandal touched even the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan, who was accused of purchasing love potions and poisons from La Voisin. Louis XIV, desperate to avoid further embarrassment, eventually shut down the investigations before they could implicate anyone else close to the throne. The Chamber Ardente was dissolved. Remaining prisoners were quietly disposed of without trial. The whole ugly affair was buried under royal decree. But Marie Madeleine's legacy persisted beyond the immediate scandal. Her case became the template for understanding poison murder, the slow administration of small doses, the exploitation of family trust, the careful mimicry of natural disease. Toxicology as a forensic science developed partially in response to her crimes, as doctors and investigators sought ways to detect poisoning that could no longer be dismissed as mysterious illness. Medical examiners began paying closer attention to suspicious deaths within families. Authorities started investigating cases where multiple family members died of similar symptoms over short periods. The Paris police established protocols for preserving bodies and testing for common poisons. Marie Madeleine had been so successful because poison detection was virtually non-existent in her era. Her crimes helped create the field that would make such murders far more difficult to commit successfully. Her story also entered French literature and popular consciousness as the ultimate cautionary tale about aristocratic corruption. Writers like Alexandre Dumas referenced her in their works. Philosophers cited her case when discussing the moral degradation of the privileged classes. She became the archetype of the beautiful monster, the elegant noblewoman whose appearance concealed absolute evil. What made Marie Madeleine's crimes particularly disturbing was not simply their number or their brutality, but their emotional coldness. She murdered her own father while holding his hand and weeping false tears. She eliminated her brothers while playing the grieving sister. She poisoned helpless hospital patients while performing charity. She maintained perfect social appearances while orchestrating multiple deaths. There was no passion in her murders, no heat of the moment, no explosive rage. Only calculation, patience, and an absolute absence of empathy. Modern psychological analysis would likely diagnose her as a psychopath, someone capable of mimicking human emotion while feeling none, someone who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated or eliminated as circumstances required. She demonstrated classic psychopathic traits: superficial charm, pathological lying, lack of remorse, grandiose sense of self-worth, manipulation of others, and most critically, the inability to experience genuine emotional connections with other human beings. Her victims suffered horribly. Arsenic poisoning, her primary method, causes agonizing symptoms. The stomach cramps feel like internal tearing. The vomiting is violent and often bloody. The diarrhea leads to painful dehydration. The burning sensation in the throat and esophagus makes swallowing impossible. The progressive organ failure creates cumulative suffering that builds over weeks or months. And throughout it all, the victim remains conscious, aware, experiencing every moment of their body's breakdown. Marie Madeleine watched this suffering repeatedly. She observed it in hospital patients when refining her technique. She witnessed it in her father over months of progressive poisoning. She saw it in both her brothers as they died identical deaths. She never flinched, never hesitated, never showed genuine compassion. To her, their pain was simply data, information about dosage and timing, evidence of her method's effectiveness. The hospital victims remain particularly haunting. These were already suffering people, often poor, often dying from existing illnesses, who accepted kindness from a wealthy volunteer because they had no reason to suspect danger. Marie Madeleine used their vulnerability as cover for experimentation. She turned their desperate gratitude into opportunity for murder. She exploited their weakness to refine techniques she would later use on her family. How many died? She confessed to approximately 30 during her torture, but the true number may have been higher. Hospital records from that era were imprecise. Many deaths went unrecorded. Patients from poor families often died without anyone noting their passing. Marie Madeleine could have killed 50, 70, even 100 people during her years of charitable work without anyone tracking the true toll. Each death represented a person, someone's father or mother, someone's child, someone with hopes and fears and experiences. They died alone, in pain, confused about why the kind noblewoman's visits always preceded their worsening symptoms. They died believing they simply had bad luck, that their diseases had progressed naturally, that God had chosen to take them. They never knew they had been murdered, never knew they were nothing more than test subjects for a serial killer perfecting her craft. The efficiency of Marie Madeleine's murders reflected the calculating intelligence that made her so dangerous. She understood that successful murder required more than just killing. It required avoiding suspicion, maintaining social standing, creating plausible alternative explanations. She manipulated doctors by ensuring symptoms matched known diseases. She manipulated investigators by being the grieving family member rather than a suspect. She manipulated society by performing the role of devoted daughter and sister so convincingly that suspicion seemed absurd. Only St. Croix's accidental death exposed her. Without that laboratory accident, without the discovery of his incriminating documents, Marie Madeleine might have continued indefinitely. She might have murdered her husband eventually. She might have killed her children to consolidate their inheritance. She might have eliminated business rivals, romantic competitors, or anyone else who inconvenienced her. The only limit to her killing was her ambition and opportunity. Her execution brought satisfaction to many but solved nothing fundamental. Other poisoners continued operating. The social conditions that encouraged murder as a solution to problems, rigid inheritance laws, trapped marriages, financial desperation among the aristocracy, remained unchanged. Marie Madeleine was punished, but the system that enabled her crimes continued. The Paris underworld of poison suppliers persisted despite increased enforcement. New law voisins emerged to serve clients willing to pay for deadly solutions. The affair of the poison's prosecutions eliminated some suppliers but drove others deeper underground. Poison remained available to those determined enough to find it and wealthy enough to afford it. What changed was awareness. Marie Madeleine's case made poison murder impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as rare or theoretical. She demonstrated that serial murder could happen in respectable society, that monsters could wear silk and speak politely, that danger could come from family members rather than strangers. Her crimes shattered comfortable illusions about safety and trust. The medical community began developing tests for common poisons. The Marsh test for arsenic, created in 1836, owed its existence partially to cases like Marie Madeleine's, where murderers had exploited the inability to detect poisoning definitively. Forensic toxicology emerged as a discipline because investigators needed tools to identify what Marie Madeleine had proven so effective: murder disguised as natural death. Legal systems adapted as well. Authorities began preserving bodies longer in suspicious deaths. prosecutors started looking for patterns in family deaths. Investigators learned to question convenient coincidences. The presumption of innocence remained, but the presumption of natural death weakened when circumstances suggested otherwise. Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers became the measuring stick against which other poison cases were compared. For centuries after her execution, prosecutors in France would reference the Brinvilliers case when arguing for poison murder convictions. Defense attorneys would cite differences from the Brinvilliers pattern when claiming innocence for their clients. She became the prototype, the standard, the exemplar of calculating poison murder. Her story persisted in French culture for generations. Parents warned children about her. Writers used her as a character or inspiration. Historians analyzed her psychology. She became a boogeyman, a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil could wear a beautiful face and speak with cultured eloquence. The final irony was that Marie-Madeleine achieved a kind of immortality through her crimes. She wanted wealth, independence, freedom from family oversight. She murdered to obtain these things. Instead, she gained only infamy, her name permanently associated with poison, betrayal, and monstrous cruelty. She wanted to be remembered as a successful noblewoman. Instead, she is remembered as one of history's most prolific female serial killers. Her ashes were scattered across Paris, erased from the earth. But her story could not be erased. It lived on in court records, in trial transcripts, in the collective memory of a society forced to confront the possibility that danger could come from within families, that trust could be weaponized, that the people closest to you might be planning your death while smiling to your face. Today, more than 3 centuries after her execution, Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers remains a figure of fascination and horror. True crime enthusiasts study her methods. Historians analyze her motivations. Psychologists examine her lack of empathy. She represents something fundamentally disturbing about human nature. The capacity for systematic cruelty, the ability to commit murder without emotional involvement, the possibility that some people view others as obstacles rather than as fellow humans. Her victims, her father Antoine Drew Diabery, her brothers Antoine and François Diabery, and the dozens of nameless hospital patients, are largely forgotten. History remembers the killer but forgets those killed. This is perhaps the final cruelty of Marie-Madeleine's crimes, that her victims became footnotes in her story rather than stories in their own right. They died in agony. They suffered weeks or months of progressive poisoning. They experienced pain that no one should endure, and they did so while being deceived by someone they trusted, someone who should have protected them, someone who chose murder over love, wealth over family, convenience over human life. Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers died on July 16, 1676, her body burned to ash, her existence erased from Paris streets. But the echoes of her crimes, the horror of her betrayals, the cold calculation of her murders, these persist. They remind us that monsters are real, that they sometimes live among us disguised as respectable citizens, that trust can be lethal when extended to those who view human life as expendable. Her story is not just about poison and murder. It is about the capacity for evil that exists in seemingly ordinary people. It is about how intelligence without empathy creates monsters. It is about what happens when ambition recognizes no moral boundaries, when desire faces no ethical constraints, when human connection becomes nothing more than manipulation and opportunity. The angel of death wore expensive gowns and spoke in cultured tones. She attended church services and hosted elegant dinners. She volunteered at hospitals and visited sick relatives. And for 7 years, she left a trail of bodies behind her, each death carefully planned, each murder perfectly executed, each victim's suffering observed with clinical detachment. This is the true horror of Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers. Not that she killed. Killing, while terrible, is not unprecedented in human history, but that she killed without feeling, murdered without rage, destroyed lives without experiencing any emotional consequence. She was the perfect predator, intelligent, patient, charming, and absolutely devoid of human compassion. Her execution satisfied justice but provided no comfort. Because for every Marie Madeline caught and punished, the possibility remains that others exist. Equally calculating, equally cruel, equally skilled at hiding their true nature behind masks of respectability and charm. Her story does not end with her death. It continues as a warning, a reminder, a dark truth about the potential that exists within humanity for monstrous acts committed with a smile. The poison mistress is dead, but the poison, both literal and metaphorical, remains. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.